response. It's
Hey, because I was also like,
we gave Jared
okay.
one of the pamphlets.
We're going to go
Really
ahead and get started
Yes.
this morning.
the pamphlet
We have a lot to do as usual, and we'll start with the central question of our time, which is the question of war and peace, which is the question of, in its specifics, of the Ukraine. And I kind of want to start, I want to turn it over to my worthy colleague, Jeremiah Kim, to open it up for us, and then we could talk about it and what it means for the American people, the American political situation. And then we're going to continue our reading of Hegel's Science of Logic and getting through the introduction. So Jeremiah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try to just give some updates based off of the news that I've seen online, especially like, I think Doc and I have mentioned that YouTube channel, the Duran, with that commentator Alexander Mercouris, and they provide really great updates. So a lot of what I'm saying is just reiterating things that they've said on their channel. But I think first on like the military front, there's a lot of propaganda in the West constantly that Russia's losing the war militarily, but that's very far from the truth. Partially it's because they misconstrue the Russian military strategy to begin with, which is not the traditional way that the West wages war, but is more about, I think Doug's mentioned like the cauldron strategy of encirclement. And it's interesting because part of what people have pointed out is that Russia's military strategy in the Ukraine, it mirrors what they also did in Syria, because they were called in by the Syrian government of President Assad, to basically help in a similar way to basically radicalize like the sort of extremist elements in Syria, in the same way that they're de-radicalizing like the neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine as well. But you see, like, if you see in the news, like cities like Mariupol, which are mentioned a lot, but that's all part of like this whole Russian strategy of like creating these encirclements around cities, especially, and they're focusing primarily on the eastern part of Ukraine. They don't really care that much about the west, but basically they encircle the cities. They create what's called a humanitarian corridor in which citizens can are free to leave if they want, and they basically try to focus it on like placing extreme amounts of pressure on like the actual like extremist military, paramilitary groups that are like located in that city. And yeah, there's just a lot of confusing information going around, especially because social media is almost, especially in the West, it's designed to spread propaganda, to spread like misleading information. But part of what the Russians are accusing the Ukrainians, especially like the sort of Azov battalion neo-Nazi groups, of doing is using like citizens as human shields, basically to increase the amount of civilian casualties. And but that being said, like at least from the Russian like Ministry of Defense, they are very, like, if you cut through all the noise of like the Western news, the Russian like defense ministry is very confident that they are like very close to achieving like the main parts of their strategic mission in Ukraine, which are like, as they see it, like denazification and demilitarization, which basically means, I think, yeah, there's like an article I was saying that they've at this point basically completely destroyed the Air Force and the Air Defense Forces, as well as the Ukrainian Navy has basically ceased to exist. And you don't really hear about any of this stuff because like part of it is because the Russians are so focused on eliminating specifically the military targets and making sure that Ukraine like can no longer be able to mount like an invasion against Russia. I think in terms of casualties, it was like around 1,300 like Russian military personnel have been killed, whereas 14,000 Ukrainian soldiers, I believe, have been killed. So it's like also, yeah, it's kind of very jarring to read about this in the news because they're like, Russia like is losing general after general, like they're losing this war. But if you actually like look into the facts, it's like Ukraine is suffering the heaviest losses. And then that kind of bleeds into like the propaganda front. Like they, the Western news outlets really love bringing Zelensky on to give these interviews and speeches where it's very clear that he's in front of a green screen, but they still do it anyways. Like it's just bizarre. Like you'll see on Twitter, like the AP will like post these videos of like Zelensky speaking, but like they don't. It's like everyone knows that he's in front of a green screen, but they just pretend that he's not in front of a green screen. But yeah, so it's unclear. Like, is he in Ukraine? Is he in Poland? No one really knows. Probably the Russians know, but if they wanted to take him out, they could. But so there's that part of it in which I think I saw like Zelensky was in talks with like the Academy Awards to like talk at the Oscars or something. So he's really playing it up, and they're really playing him up as like this kind of celebrity figure, so that basically it's like, the West wants to, they're most focused on winning the propaganda and ideological war by any means, but they can do that without actually having to think about even like the economic front, the diplomatic front, and then the actual military front. And yeah, there's just been some, also like, you're seeing this like trend of videos that are coming out of like the Ukrainian paramilitary forces like abusing the Ukrainian citizens, and it's very bizarre because it's the Ukrainians who are posting these videos because they're very proud of it, that they're, I don't know if you've seen, but they're like tying people to lampposts and like beating them and all this stuff. Yeah, also it's hard to see because then like the social media platforms take it down because they're like, this is Russian disinformation. But also like, I think in the past few days, like if people have heard word about like the biolabs in Ukraine that the US the Pentagon was funding, it's come out that there are possible connections between Hunter Biden, who already had implications in Ukraine that they tried to silence during the election, but that he was possibly involved in the funding of the bioweapons research. And they'll try to portray it as, no, this is defensive biological research, but if you're basically doing like essentially like gain of function research on the most like effective bioweapons you can create as a defensive thing, that's still biological research. And like Victoria Nuland, who is infamous for playing that role in the Maidan coup in Ukraine in 2014, she was like, yeah, we can't let these labs get into the hands of the Russians, which is very clearly implying that there are like biological weapons involved. So that's, I guess, on that front. And then on the diplomatic side, you're seeing, I don't know what you've seen, Doc, but it seems like there's a lot more desperation on the part of the West and the NATO alliance. There was a meeting with the NATO leaders, like Biden, I think, went to this NATO meeting, but based on reports that I was seeing, it's much less a tone of like thinking they can just boss Russia around, but it's more they're increasingly just like begging Russia to end the war because they know that the ball is in Russia's court. And then meanwhile, the U.S. and all the NATO countries are sending like hundreds of millions of dollars, military funds to Ukraine, like these fighter jets, like anti-aircraft missiles, all that stuff. But they're stopping short of sending troops into Ukraine because they know that, one, it would trigger like an actual World War III militarily, but also that they know they can't win in that conflict.
Can I just say one thing about this World War III trope? A war with NATO and Russia is not World War III.
Oh, okay.
You see what I'm saying? I mean, this kind of Eurocentrism that the international community is really Europe and North America. You see what I'm saying? And other white nations like or white ruled nations like Australia and New Zealand, and then, you know, the wannabe white ruling class in Japan. So is that the world?
Right.
You know? No, it is not the world.
Right.
In fact, they're now admitting that the majority of the world's population is not with the West.
Yeah.
And even a lot of those nations, let us say in Asia and Africa, that voted with the United Nations in the General Assembly, a lot of them did it under severe economic and political pressure. And other kind of pressures, you know, like if you're from a small nation, let's say a small economically weak nation in West Africa, and you're the ambassador to the United Nations, and the United States comes to you and say, well, we know that your daughter is studying law at Harvard, and she's on a scholarship. If you want her to stay at Harvard and stay on scholarship, you better know how to vote. That type of thing. But, so that's, you know, pulling people's strings and blackmailing them, which of course the United States does. But the concept that a war between NATO and it's only hypothetical, believe me. Can I just, you don't mind if I interrupt you? It's a hypothesis, and it's a propaganda ploy. Oh, if we're setting our red lines up, and if the Russians cross this red line, then we'll have to consider what to do. No, you've already considered what to do. Right. Your people don't want war, and therefore you can't go to war. We're going to talk about that in a minute. The shift in the United States population away from war. And I was saying to Nathan, I was saying to Emily and Allison and Kathy on the bus, I have never seen the anti-war sentiment of the American people so high as now. Not even during the war in Vietnam. Now, it does not take a recognizable, you know, I keep putting these quotes up, it doesn't look like the anti-war movement of the 60s. In other words, a lot of it is emanating from the white working class. But it's across the working class, who are war tired, war exhausted. And I want to talk a little bit more, but can I just say one thing about war and legal justifications of war, and why to call Russia an aggressor is a complete distortion. There is in international law, and this goes back to St. Augustine, the first African pope. And I don't know if it's in Aristotle, but part of moral philosophy and the considerations of ethics and morality is the question of war. And so he theorized just and unjust wars. An unjust war is a war of aggression. A just war is a war of self-defense. There is no two ways about it. Russia's going into Ukraine was and is and will remain a war of self-defense. Most of the NATO countries recognize this. Most of the populations, I'm talking too loud, forgive me, let me calm. Most of the populations of Western Europe, European countries, and Eastern Europe understand that Russia had a just set of demands. Whether they admit it or not, this, and we have to say it again, this is a war that the Biden administration wanted. It is not a war that the Russians wanted. How do we know this? People say, oh, you know, anytime you don't go along with the war makers in this country, oh, you're an agent of a foreign government. You've heard that before. And I'll say like Du Bois said, no, I'm an agent of peace. Let's start there. But when the Russians put forward a set of principles to guide negotiations about the architecture of military and political relations on the European continent, it included Ukraine. What the Russians were saying, like any nation would say, you have put the most lethal weapons of mass destruction on our borders. While Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and that's a hollow thing anyway. Ukraine was being armed, trained, as though it were a NATO member. The United States had set up all of these biological, chemical war labs all over the Ukraine. What for? To use on Western Europe? No, to use on the Russians. And in fact, they were doing experiments to make these weapons specific, these viral weapons, these biological weapons, specific to people who had Slavic genes. This is how far they had gone. But even more than that, Ukraine is as militarized as any NATO country, probably more militarized than Poland or Germany. And then on top of it, and this is one thing that Lavrov and the Russians said time and again, you have an army, your best soldiers, 60,000 of them, on the borders of the Donbass. You have never tried to implement or have accepted the Minsk agreement, which simply said Russian speakers cannot be criminalized because they speak Russian. And so the Russians were seeking a diplomatic way out of this. The German and French governments, now the German government is a weak, I mean, it's even weaker than Biden, tell you how you get that low, I don't know. But so weak, even though Schultz wanted to negotiate and had gone to Moscow and met with Putin and all of this, and Macron, but these are, you know, this, but I'll get back to it. They knew there was something legitimate in what the Russians were calling for. And that didn't mean that every plank in their negotiating thing, their negotiating principles, had to be agreed to. But let's start by talking about this. When the Russians presented, Anthony Blinken and them said, no, yeah, we got your message, yeah, we'll think about it. Right. Trivialize them. Now, Lavrov is not your average diplomat. The guy is very experienced, very eloquent. In fact, whenever they talk about the West, they don't talk about them as our enemies. They say our Western partners.
Right.
I mean, it's so, they have this this training, where as a diplomat, there are certain politenesses and so on. It's not like Anthony Blinken or this Jake Sullivan going to Ankara and you're going to point your finger at, what's his name,
Yang Jiechi?
Yeah, the foreign minister of China, Yang Zi, I think.
Wang, okay.
Yeah, right. But to point your finger across the table at these very experienced diplomats, and you're going to read them the law. We're going to tell you what we're going.
Right.
These people said, "Who are these fools?" I mean, really, you can't imagine. The same with Lavrov. In other words, it is the Biden administration, not even these weak European governments, and they are shameful. And they're going to pay a price for it. I'll get to that in a minute. The Biden administration said, we're not going to negotiate with you over anything. You know what I'm saying? And in fact, if you don't like it, the ball is in your court. Let's see what you're going to do. You see, and that's when they start throwing them threats. We're going to put all of these sanctions on you. And Putin, it's like they say, you know, the Biden administration was selling wolf tickets, and Putin bought them wolf tickets. See, y'all don't know. See, it's like if I'm a bully and I keep threatening you, pointing my finger like the Nick, pointing my finger in your face, you know, no, you ain't nothing, you know. All that. And then you buy the wolf tickets, and you say, well, come on, let's get it on then.
Like the boy who cried wolf.
Say that again?
It's like the boy who cried wolf.
Not quite the boy.
Well, like you called it out on the bluff.
Or maybe it is the boy, I don't know. But I just know it from street talk. You know, somebody selling wolf tickets, you know.
Y'all
Somebody
never heard
gonna
that?
bully everybody. Oh, wait a minute.
No?
So,
He told me.
Putin bought the wolf tickets and went in there. But they didn't go in, and this is what Jeremiah is saying. They were not conducting a war to destroy the Ukraine. If they wanted to, they have the weapons to do it. They could have done it. As Scott Ritter said, they went soft. Protect the population because we want something to build. But this guy, Zelensky, who I believe has what on the street we call a nose problem.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, would you agree with that? Okay. Everybody knows what a nose problem, you don't know what a nose problem is. Hunter?
Brown nosy?
Brown nosy?
No.
Is that what's happening?
Negative.
No, a nose problem.
The drug problem.
Drugs.
Cocaine problem. He's on something.
Yeah.
The man is not in his right mind. And it's all a performance. And he is not in Kiev most of the time. He's in Warsaw, somewhere in Poland. And it's all an act. It's all political theater. And as they say, the chickens will come home to roost. And those chickens are coming home to roost because the sanctions, we're going to put unbelievable sanctions on Russia. Now, I heard Lavrov say, well, so what? I mean, we got 5,000 sanctions on us. You know.
Already.
But now, I think I heard it come out of this meeting, this NATO meeting this week, where they're now saying that some European leader was saying, we're in economic war with Russia. But it's an economic war that Western Europe cannot win. Because they are totally dependent for its energy on Russia. Gas, oil, coal, as well as other precious metals. and they've done some things which have turned most countries in the world against them. When they sanctioned the central bank and their concept, their plan, we will destroy your currency, which means we will destroy your ability to trade in the world. You see what I'm saying? But ha ha ha, it didn't work. It backfired. Now, the Prime Minister of Germany, I mean, the guy is so weak. It's like, will you stand up for your country, Germany? You know, the major manufacturing country in Europe, the biggest economy, and here you are, like, you know, crawling on your knees. But he had to admit, he said, if we move to get off of our dependence upon Russian natural gas too soon, it will throw Europe into a recession. Now that word recession doesn't really describe what it would be. You know, we have to go back to the word depression. Side by side with inflation. Now, in economic theory and policy, I just want to say this. Given the way the world economy is configured and the way capitalism has evolved and the almost inordinate role of bank and finance capital, that Western economies don't operate the way they used to operate. You see what I'm saying? Usually when you talked about a recession or depression, that was one way of wiping out inflation. But now we're looking at the possibility of both happening at the same time. So you would get like Germany, which is a manufacturing country, produces a lot of things, unlike Britain, which produces hardly anything and is totally organized around finance. Okay? If Germany goes into a recession, it could be a recession with inflation. How the two will operate together, we don't know. You see what I'm saying? Already inflation was happening, result of COVID and the policies to fight COVID, and then all of this money being pumped into the Western economies, and then the external forces of markets locking up, you know, world markets locking up, and that driving prices up, and then this. All of this stuff over the last year, year and a half, has pumped inflation up, you know? And inflation is one of the most difficult economic problems to solve in modern capitalist societies. Nobody wants that. Because there have not yet developed policies to offset it, to reverse it, except raising interest rates and driving the economy into a recession. You know what I'm saying? But it's politically so perilous for the ruling elite. Now, we already know there's a crisis of legitimacy. Now we're into science of logic, you know what I'm saying? You know, these intersecting dialectics. The West will lose. The West is losing. And Jerry's right about this. They're not winning the war in Ukraine. The question is, if there is now this Zelensky knows problem. You don't know from minute to minute what he's saying. You know, it's all a big show, a big performance for him. But he's talking about, we want to negotiate, but we want to negotiate on, but hey man, you ain't got no strong hand, but you don't have, you know. The question is, will most of Ukraine, what is today Ukraine, become part of Russia? Now Putin and his group in the leadership have argued that Ukraine as it currently exists was a political invention of the Bolsheviks. Probably was. However, under the political rubric of the Soviet Union, that Ukraine could exist as a fraternal republic among other Soviet republics, as an independent nation which was then manipulated by corrupt elites, drug dealers, neo-Nazis, and on and on and on. It became this grotesque, dangerous nation. And that's what it is. You know? Whether that western part, which might include Kiev, and I still call it K-I-E-V. I don't go with this Kiev and Viv and no. Let's go by the original name. You know, Kiev. Whether that will remain in some kind of rump Ukraine, and whether that part of Ukraine will become a part of Poland and maybe Finland, we don't know. But one thing is for certain. The Ukrainian government had the option to choose neutrality, and they're right, denazification. The Azov, that's why Mariupol, where they show all of these things of how bad it is and the Russians did this, that, they ain't did nothing. That's the Azov Brigade. They're the equivalent in Ukraine of ISIS. We fight to the death. Well, when they say we fight to the death, that means all of y'all, the ordinary population, gonna die. Because we're not letting you out, because our tactics of warfare is to use ordinary people as human shields. You understand what I'm saying? Now, combined forces, the Donetsk People's Republic, their forces, and them people, look, they're fighting for their lives, believe me. And when they go in there up against the Azov Brigade, or when they bring the Chechens in and certain other, you know, people that all they want to do is fight. You got different people like that. When you call us, then you want some heavy lifting done. And when they went in there and got with them cats, they told them, you know who we are? Let me reintroduce myself. And they took them down. They took them down. And see, people say, well, are you for the Russians? Yes, I am. Why? They said, well, Tony, why are you down with them? Haven't you looked at the recent news on CNN? No, I haven't, by the way. I am down with them because I hold to the theory of just war. And a just war, this war, is not just a war about Ukraine. It is not essentially about Ukraine. It is about what the world order will look like going forward. You guys are very fortunate to live right now. No, but very fortunate to be alive right now and to be conscious. If you were alive right now and just lost in the sauce, as they say, Or as the Whispers say about one of my favorite doo-wop groups, Lost and Turned Out. You know, you'd be confused, you'd be depressed, you'd be alienated. But to be alive now and to be conscious is something very good and very important. One young woman said to me, "Oh, I feel so isolated. Everybody disagrees with me." I said, "Don't worry about that. This is a moment of ideological fluidity. You know, all things are in motion. Like Lenin said, a week is like a year. You see what I'm saying? Things are moving very quickly. People might say, well, I'm down with Ukraine. Well, what they're saying, I'm down with what I saw on television. Because they don't know the issues as such. And that's not, I'm not putting people down because they don't. But they will change overnight. They will change overnight. And world events have now become world historic events. The world won't be the same after this. When the foreign ministers of India and China meet in Delhi, not in Beijing, in Delhi, it's very important. Now, they said, look, things went slow. And they met just last week. Things went slow, okay? But cool heads will say that there's a lot of baggage that each side brings. You know what I'm saying? Let me give you an example. Y'all too young to see it like this, but you get two people of a certain age, and they're gonna start dating. You know what I'm saying? And before you know it, they cussing each other out and angry because each side bring a lot of baggage. I've been wounded in the wars of love, on the battlefield of love. That's why y'all crack me up talking. I said, didn't you know that love was a battlefield? How do you think this is? But anyway, but each side brings baggage. And they have to know how to think that out. 1962 is not 2022.
That's true.
You understand? All these border disputes, you know, demilitarize the border. Now let's get on with the bigger questions. Because India must understand that these fools running the Biden administration had threatened them with sanctions because they voted to abstain at the UN on the US resolution. Now you're going to sanction India. So India said, well, you know, go ahead with your bad self. We want Russian gas, and we're not going to use your money. See, this is that subtlety of the anti-racist. See, that arrogance of the white man, my dollar. You know, I'm the man. And if I want to, I'll take my money and you can't trade.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Right.
You got to see that subtlety. Oh, let me just make this point, Jerry. You know, you got to see, it's just like any people, anybody. You know, if I keep always in your face, if you don't do, I'm gonna, you know, shoot, I'll slap you upside the head. Now, it's an ancient civilization. And some 55-year-old white boy coming gonna tell you, oh, you ain't nothing. I got all the money. And they told India that. So India said, look at here. I'm dealing with Russia and we're using the ruble and the rupee. Double R. We don't, see, and this is the key now. You see, you try to isolate people. This makes the unjustness of the U.S. position.
Yeah.
Unjust. If your position was so just, nations like India, Pakistan, Tanzania, they would see the justness of it. But no, you're unjust. And you want to hurt India, an emerging economy. And Russia said to the West, you're going to pay for your oil in rubles now, money. Don't come in here with no dollars.
Right.
You want our gas and oil? Cough up some rubles. So I got you in a headlock. You thought you was gonna be cute. No, I'm serious. I hate to put it this way, but to dramatize it, like the West, like the German government. Oh, we're going to, by 2023, not be dependent on Russian gas any. At that point, the whole world fell on the floor laughing. Oh, for 60, 70 years you've been dependent, and in 1 year you're going to break your dependence. Oh yeah, we're going to go to the United Arab Republic and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Arab states and get them to cough up some liquefied natural gas. So Biden called them nations up. Ring, ring. And they got a recorded message. Ain't nobody home. Yeah. These countries that are supposedly dependent upon the US dollar did not return Biden's call.
You're right.
And then the Saudis said, look at here, we're dealing with China.
Yeah.
Not with the dollar, the petrodollar. You see what I'm saying? I would like to explain that, but that's another question. We're dealing with the petro renminbi. We're dealing people of color to people of color. We're dealing with our own money now.
Yeah, that's good.
You see what I'm saying? Don't think they don't see this.
Right.
You understand? When a cat from China come and hook up with somebody from Saudi Arabia, they looking, say, damn, you look more like me than Anthony Biden does. Anthony Blinken.
Might as well.
Or
Yeah.
Joe Biden.
Might as
You
well.
see, this is what we call the intersubjective. What I see when I look in your eyes,
Yeah.
and what I don't see when I look in the eyes of that other one. This is huge. It is huge. Now Germany, cough up the rubles. So the ruble, which had risen 145 to $1 to $100, in other words,
Oh, okay.
all of a sudden it's coming into parity. $100 for 100 rubles. And it might be $110 for 100 rubles. In other words, to get natural gas, Germany and France and other Western countries will have to pay in rubles, which means they have to go on the money markets. Markets. Never know what markets they talking about. Most time they talking about the stock market.
Yeah.
That ain't the market the market I deal with is Whole Foods or Acme or something like that. But now you got to buy rubles. You have infuriated, and Biden, oh God, this is a disaster. He gonna go over there and have a video meeting a week and a half ago with, of all people, Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, as they say in the black church, is clothed in his right mind. The man is, first of all, he's an intellectual. Biden ain't clothed in his right mind. The man is thrown off. I don't mean to make light of a cat that is in the early stages of dementia. But look, man, don't be trying to act like you gonna do this. So he approaches Xi Jinping on a video conference. There'll be consequences if you don't denounce Russia. That man said, wait a minute, dog. I mean, Who you talking to? You can just imagine. This is a nation of 1.4 billion people, by some accounts, the largest economy in the world. And this feeble man who can't put two sentences together is going to literally point his finger, not to say, well, what is your position and, could we negotiate? No, I'm pointing my finger and telling you that if you don't change your policy, I'm going to make you pay. And the Chinese said, no uncertain terms, let's see. I say all of that. We have to see the profound changes in the world. That peace is the agenda, but peace with justice. That we have to understand who the aggressor is, and that we have to constantly help our people to understand what is aggression and what is self-defense. My last point, I'll just say this. You all have heard of this congresswoman from rural Georgia named Marjorie Taylor Greene, the one that they built up and made the poster child for every kind of conspiracy theory and white supremacy and all of that. Well, she has come out against this war and basically supporting the Russians. And in fact, when Zelensky did that, that video thing before the US Congress, when they all stood up, she refused to give him a standing ovation. And I'm going to just say what that means, and then I'll turn it back over to Jerry. Another, I think, first-term congressman from North Carolina came out and said that Zelensky is nothing but a thug who's running a corrupt regime, etc. Of course, you know what Donald Trump has said, and he had to be, but my point is this. Marjorie Taylor Greene represents a rural Georgia, primarily white district. What does that mean? That she speaks like this. What does it mean for us when we talk about tactical allies? Maybe everything Marjorie Greene stands for we don't agree with. But on the strategic question of the world's future, I agree with Marjorie Taylor Greene. And I'm not ashamed of it. I agree with Marjorie Taylor Greene that 95 or even 100% of the Congressional Black Caucus who support this BS. What does it say? The ascendancy of a class consciousness not yet fully crystallized. A lot of times class consciousness begins as an instinct. It ain't right. It ain't good for my constituents in rural Tennessee. You see what I'm saying? And you always give the working class the ability to fight. You don't, if you're a so-called radical or leftist, out the gate, no, they ain't gonna fight. No, they're fascists. No, they're white supremacists. You have to always understand that oppression leads to resistance. Economic hardship, deprivation, other forms of injustices that a white elite can visit upon working people. Believe me, these people feel that. They know what they're hearing. They know where that's coming from. They know the class essence of them, of the elite pointing fingers at them, accusations against them. You don't know those people. You know, like King said, you don't hear their cries for justice, but we have to. We have to. And I take Marjorie Taylor Greene any day over Maxine Waters. And Maxine Waters and I look alike. But like we say in the black community, you might be my color, but you ain't my kind. Marjorie Greene might not be my color, but she's my kind. Because the future of humanity is being decided right now. And to position black folk, because you claim to be our leaders, on the side of an unjust war, of an unjust ruling class, I consider to be a political crime against black people. And it is, given our history. But I stopped it. Go ahead, Jerry. I mean, I don't mean to.
I mean, just to add, I think if you listen to people like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Tucker, you know, they make it so crystal clear that the U.S. and the Western ruling elite's war against Russia and against this rising tide of darker humanity as a whole is a war, it's also a class war against the American working class. Like that, even, yeah, like the financial, like this huge financial nuclear bomb that they waged against Russia, that is also ultimately a war, increasing the war against the working class at home. And yeah, it's just been remarkable to listen to, like, just that clear understanding. Like, it's not even that Tucker is like fully on the side of like the Russians at all, but he sees the ramifications of all of this. And I think one of the things that I enjoyed hearing or listening to from like that podcast with the Duran guys and Alexander Mercouris and one of their guests was the ruling, like the US ruling elite at this point, they are basically operating off of the high of the 90s in which they emerged triumphant. And they see things as basically like, you know, like the TV show West Wing, you know, where, you know, it's like liberalism is triumphant around the world, and they basically see China as just their factory. They see Russia as like, you know, like not anything. Like I think Obama was like
raw material.
Yeah, raw materials. Like Obama was like, Russia doesn't matter. Their GDP is like 1/10 the size of ours, or something like that, you know. And they see the American people in the same way as just, you know, like basically pawns that they can just move around on the chessboard. But they're operating on at their basic premise the wrong assumptions and the wrong view of what reality is. And so they can't even do the whole like the realpolitik in the right way, because they fundamentally don't understand like where like the world is and where the world is moving and where the balance of power is. Because yeah, I think you mentioned, but one of the most extraordinary things is that the value of the Russian ruble has actually gone up, and it hasn't, like the inflation is basically, it's starting to reverse in Russia. And that was the whole point of like basically sanctioning the central bank of Russia, was to basically affect regime change through hyperinflation. And it's already gone back because, you know, Putin is like, you know, all of the unfriendly countries, you have to pay us in rubles. And meanwhile, they're strengthening their alliances and trade with the rest of Asia and Africa as well. And I think, yeah, I don't know, that was just one of the like more remarkable things, and that like there is a populist anti-war tradition in the United States which is re-emerging. and making itself known after this whole
Yeah.
period of the Cold War, in which the American populace was led down this path of conflating patriotism with warmongering, of waging war against the rest of the world, when in fact what it really means, like where the true potential of America lies, is in like seeking a path of peace, and for America to become like just an ordinary nation again, rather than this obscene empire which thinks that it can control basically the entire world. And I think, yeah, like the basic like dynamic in which like people like in America are starting to realize that their interests are not aligned with the interests of their ruling class. I think that is, it's really big. And yeah, I think just one last thing, which is, you know, like the whole Kiev versus Kiev thing.
Yeah.
All of it is, it's a marketing thing, because the Ukrainians were like, or the Ukrainian like tourism people or like the marketing people were like, we don't want people to look up Google search Kiev
Yes.
because they'll see all of the corruption that's been happening in Ukraine, and like all the shady stuff that's been happening with like the Maidan and all of that stuff over the past like couple decades. And instead we're gonna change the spelling to Kyiv, so that then you'll only see stuff which has been happening in the news, in which you only see like the, you know, the Ukrainians being the victims of this unjust aggression. So all of it's like, it's a marketing thing. And yeah, even like the whole like Kyiv is still standing. It's like the Russians don't even care that much about Kiev. Like they care about like the eastern part of Ukraine.
That's
you know?
right.
And yeah, it's just
And the army on the east, which is
Mhm.
the biggest army, the
Right.
most well-equipped army.
right.
Mhm.
Right. But yeah, a lot of this is basically the ruling elite no longer, like, they've completely lost touch with reality itself. And yeah, I think, as you were saying, it presents a huge opportunity for ordinary people and for those who like are like really do see like that aspect of peace with justice, as you were saying.
Yes.
So yeah.
I don't know, are there any people who on the chat, or anybody
Yes,
here?
but yeah, Daniel would also go first though.
I was gonna bring up
Yes.
something. Last week you had said, a comment you made was that there's so much focus on what Russia is doing while not fully understanding the nature and context of it, but also the important question being, what is America doing? And actually, are we looking, or is the nation looking at itself and why it's in this position? And so actually when I was watching like this episode that Tucker was having, you know, he's not the clearest on Russia. And he said, we should be against Russia. But at the same time, he was saying, like, what he was saying was also overlapping, which is that why are we supporting Zelensky when, I think it was last week or like 2 weeks ago,
Oh yeah.
when he was banning opposition like parties within Ukraine. And he said actually why, like the West, the reason why the ruling class is backing Zelensky, because that's the kind of rule that they want to have here. And so that's been like, it was super jarring to like watch Tucker and for him to say that. And then also the other point is with like how emerging or nations are responding to the US also reminds me of Muhammad Ali and what he said about white people that he had fought in the ring, where their tactic of battle is like brute force and intimidation within the ring. But what he was able to learn is that because he was facing that, he was a lot more creative in how he would fight. And I think also, like the US's actions throughout the past century reflect that as well, where it comes from bullying and intimidation. But now exactly because of that reason, countries have had to find ways around it, and to think creatively. And I think that's also what Russia has had to face for a while, where this isn't something that that is totally unexpected. It's not that they thought that the US would like actually work with them. And so in some ways they are also like figuring out creatively what will work to face whether like the sanctions that have been thrown at them, and the like, yeah, and like the way discourse happens with both Western nations, but also with allies that they're also finding throughout the rest of the world. And I think it also speaks to what you're saying, which is like, what is the natural order of things? Where I think Du Bois also mentions this in Russia and America, where the way of doing politics in the US is actually very unnatural. Like this bullying and just one side always being on top. Rather, what is the interaction between nations, which is having some sense of like what you were mentioning of like diplomacy, like what is diplomacy, where people actually talk and listen to what is beneficial for you and what is beneficial for me, and not just imposing one on the other, but actually working out a common solution so that both can benefit.
That's right. Yeah, where the diplomat is not a diplomat, but a general. I'm one, you know. And Lavrov is the quintessential diplomat. If I could just say one small thing is what you and Jeremiah were saying. The paramount nature of the ideological struggle. These guys, the Blinkens, the Victoria Nulands, and the rest of them, are ideologues. You know, and as ideologues with the wrong ideology, by the way, they have learned nothing. In other words, they got their butts kicked in Vietnam, but they learned nothing. We're going, you know, and they then took, and that was a serious butt kicking, Vietnam. I mean, that was, worse than Afghanistan, and that was humiliation. But Vietnam was worse because they had maybe 400,000 troops on the ground there, and they were defeated by the combined forces of the North Vietnam Regular Army and the National Liberation Forces that had been fighting a asymmetric or guerrilla war in the South. And when they came in to what was called Saigon back then, they came in victorious, and the people welcomed and celebrated. It was ignominious for the US ruling class. And it took them at least 2 decades to politically and otherwise rebuild the US Army. And that's when they went from a conscripted army where everybody had to go in and all, like you have to do. I'm trying to prevent it as hard as I can. We need you here a little longer. But to a volunteer army, which we have today. There's no conscription. It depoliticizes the whole thing of war and peace, because if everybody got to go in, then I got something to say about whether I'm going to give my life or allow my son or daughter to give his or her life for some BS. But nonetheless, but then they took the wrong message from the collapse of the Soviet Union, which they had brought about. I'll hold to it. They took, this shows that we were right all along. Well, no, it didn't show you were right all along. And then they went on a tear after 1991, and there were 7 wars. I mean, hey guys, I'm just, shit, how come? Because I'm an internationalist. I want to prevent war because I care about people in other countries. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, they went on a tear of 7 wars. Driven, people say, well, they were wars for resources. Well, yes and no. Ideological wars. Neocons. And because of the ideological weakness of the American people, with no left, a left in the face of war and peace are talking about transgendered swimmers. You see what I'm saying? Oh, God. Joke. But let me make my point. were ideologically weak. And so these wars for ideological hegemony in the world went forward. It's, I don't know, I hope I'm making it clear. So the treasure and lives of the American people, but people around the world, were in the interest of ideologues, ideological supremacy, to rule the world ideologically. And which makes the point that we make all the time here. Whoever has the right ideas has the future. Without ideas, there is no future. And you as young people, you guys know, you see it all around you. You know what I'm saying? These were ideological wars. This war in the UK is ideological. But for the first time, they've met their match. They will lose this one. And what is it? People say ideology. What do you mean? The ideology of Western hegemonism is going to be defeated. Western hegemonism is a form of white supremacy, probably the most lethal form. Probably the most lethal form. And they will lose this. And the combination of forces domestically in this country will not look like the anti-Vietnam War documentaries, because that's what y'all's documentaries of give peace a chance and somebody playing a folk song and all that bullshit. Okay. It's going to come more organically from the Marjorie Taylor Greene's as an expression, a manifestation, not in its perfect form. And that's what I'd like to, this is the dialectical concept. Things emerge, the unity of opposites, the law of the negation of a negation, that everything exists. Its being is determined by its transformation, its motion. You know, people say, I want to know you, Jerry, but I want to know you by seeing you in your dead state. No, in your static state. But you say, no, man, to know me, you got to know me in my transformation.
Right.
I am becoming what I will be, and then more, And this is it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be cats like Tucker Carlson, who says contradictory things that he knows are contradictory because he's on the television.
Right.
And he came up under a lot of pressure. But Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's raw. I'm out of rural Georgia. Go ahead.
The interesting thing is there's contradictions even with her, because
Yes.
she originally was leaning more towards the condemning Putin thing, because she, I think, has interests in terms of invested in Ukraine, military stuff. But because she, I think, understood, as you were saying, she understands her base and understands what they want. She had to, initially she was leaning towards the more pro-war position, but
Right.
then she realized she had to
That's right.
switch because she was beholden to the people who elected her.
And good for her that she remained true to her people. I represent rural Georgia. I don't represent Manhattan.
Right.
You understand? My people are poor. I think she was. Yeah, I heard that narrative that for her, but even for her to come out like this, it was way beyond the call of duty. She could have done it a little more, down low. Well, I'm against this and that. No, she can. When Zelensky spoke, everybody stood up in the Congress, and she sat down. This is symbology. It's not just that I'm against this war, but I am going to demonstrate it in ways that are transgressive and subversive of what I'm going to do the opposite of what I'm supposed to do.
Right.
As a first-term white woman from Georgia. And I like the combination there because it does show. See, that's what we have to grasp. White woman from rural Georgia. I want more white people from rural anywhere to take the model of Marjorie Taylor Greene. Well, frankly, I want some black people to have the courage that she has. But we'll talk about that later. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Emil.
Yeah, I think one of the most successful narrative campaigns that the United States has waged is the idea that the Western values or Western liberal order is somehow opposed to fascism and opposed to Nazism. And I think, generally speaking, the international world is seeing that mask fall in this moment. With everything the United States has done to try to prevent anyone from seeing what's going on in Ukraine and what has been going on in Ukraine with these right-wing, out-and-out Nazi forces. And it speaks to what you were saying. The ideology is fundamentally one of, I would say, I guess, pan-European supremacy. And to what Jeremiah's saying, it demonstrates a severe weakness. I think I remember John McCain, who said Russia's just a gas station in a suit, or something to that effect.
Posing as a
Right.
country.
Right. Which shows what he actually thinks of that, large mass of people.
That civilization.
Yeah. I think the West has been very good at making these fantasies, these fairy tales about the other. And in doing so is able to continue this ideology, which is inherently anti-human. You're telling us that those people aren't human, and that is the only way they could justify doing what they do. Someone like Madeleine Albright, who can get up and say, yes, it was worth it to kill 500,000 children because it helps our interests.
That's great.
There's only one way you could justify that to yourself, and that's because you don't think those are human beings.
That's right.
And I was thinking of something that I think it was a Kenyan ambassador said about the difference between, the relationship they have between Chinese ambassadors who come and American and British, is that when the Chinese come, they say, we have a contract and we end up getting hospitals at the end of it. They'll build hospitals. When we talk to American ambassadors, we get lectures. That's the difference. It's
Let me let Nathan and then Derek.
Yeah, I guess I'm just excited about like the white people in this country are starting to become more conscious.
Yeah.
Because I'm not sure how the moral and spiritual issue of that separation between the rest of humanity is going to be solved. But I do know that white people do have to take their place again. Besides black people and besides the people of this country.
And it's possible, man.
So it's exciting to see.
Yes. Go ahead, Derek.
I'm just gonna say, I'm gonna reaffirm what he's saying. It's different. You grew up in Philadelphia, but I grew up in Pennsylvania too. So I always had that extended relationship with people. I could have met in Reading and Allentown and up in the Poconos where I used to go at, and stayed in a little couple towns upstate Pennsylvania, different towns. It's the idea that they're not missing out of action. It's how do we prepare ourselves for a better the better our own actions reflected to them when we meet them wherever you work at or where you walk at, and not just treat them blotted out. No one wants to feel blotted out. Maybe I learned a lot being with a lot of students in Albany High, black and white, more white than black, but I wasn't impervious to how I felt about humanity back then. But I still cared about the white folks that I hung out with, been to my house, not no one or two, a whole lot of them. But just so you just don't walk past them and give them the opportunity that Tony spoke to y'all earlier about upon your own awakening. You know, no one is sometimes awoke to these values, but once you become awakened like yourselves, then your prejudices and my own discriminations, all these other things we put on other people, too much color consciousness without human consciousness. Okay, and so that's a merit that he stands up. You know, I read as much about Washington as I know Sun Yat-sen. I read as much as any human being can read about Lincoln.
Yeah.
That the student that go to Lincoln University, my daughter went there, graduate, but just my ideas about Lincoln is saturated through me over multiple decades. Now that I learned about it, it's just saturated me with what it feels like to respond to a human being that you said is dead, but the essence of his ability and his talent went far beyond the 19th century, okay? That's to learn about another human being. And you know, and one more thing is this thing about Clausewitz, I'm not bringing it to be a militarized zombie, okay? But to appreciate Clausewitz, it's like a little bit of etiquette that we might be missing, table manners. And we don't want to understand this book that his wife had to kind of refine some of the end of it. And then other people, I watched other people over the decades come back and try to reintegrate Clausewitz so that we just don't become a Marxist, Leninist, we become multiple kind of counterparts that we need. But this is something that's been examined in West Point, and maybe even more now since the United States goaded itself into these people's higher abilities that comes from out of these Marxist, humanist, military type schools. You know what I mean? I'm not kidding around, because the West Point students, they now have to go up here to Carlisle, where at Carlisle, where the Indian school was at, now Carlisle has become a new magnet for the type of human beings that they need to understand this warfare.
Can I just say one,
Yeah.
and I want to just amplify something you're saying. Even to conduct war, you have to have a humanistic education.
Yes.
You're absolutely right
It's
about
an
that.
etiquette.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, but
Yeah, it's an etiquette and this knowledge here. The diplomatic parts, sometimes the West Point students, this is how the behavioral, we have to almost carbon some of it. If we want to be diplomatic or be concerned about diplomacy and concerned as much more about not just the art of war as Sun Tzu's, but Clausewitz, Sun Tzu's, and Hannibal, okay? Somebody understands these partitions better than we do. Breaking these people's countries up is fruitless. Administrating them like the people is fruitless. And so you can't even learn what we need to learn to help each other, you know, to make us the real Congress in Philadelphia. Us students have to become as wealthy, not materially, as the Congresses would meet to do something to take care of our cities and our community, foremost our family first too, you know, like that. So this is some of the accounts of the West Point students that they are entering into these traditions now because of Ho Chi Minh. He didn't put a licking on them. He didn't ask them to lick his boots. Now they're saying, wow, I didn't know Ho Chi Minh was Giap was there. Oh, I didn't know Mao secretly behind these doors. Oh, I didn't know that they really understood these etiquettes and language or manners. And I have to like find myself to bring these, because it's not like an everyday conversation I'm having with everybody every day like this. But it's important to remind yourself, these people don't want to be dehumanized, not because they black, but the kind of like classless people don't want to be humiliated because they don't have all of this stuff that we got over here, this stuff that we pull out on people to dehumanize each other. And if we do it at our level where we're at from the grassroots, then the harm of it is greater.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing? I mean, I'm so enthused by what you said. You know, the question of unjust wars
Yes.
is now being is under assault
Yeah.
from humanity.
Yeah.
And even you talk about Clausewitz
Yes.
and the Chinese theorist of war, whose name I can't remember.
So, some too.
So, yes.
Yeah, it was a whole bunch. There's a whole bunch of them.
And they were all, and St. Augustine.
Yeah,
The
yes.
question that we might wage war, but we have to remember that humanity must survive.
Yeah.
And that's what the nuclear age kind of took off the table.
Yeah. So just one more topic because of where I had to go at mentally, not to be seduced by everybody because something looks so good every decade. I'd be like, I'm just watching y'all. I'm observing. So it's something in Oppenheimer's character I'm bringing to the table along with Clausewitz because of the nuclear school of war doesn't care about any of us in this room here. You already been obliterated.
That's right.
What they have done when me and Tony was growing up, they're already carbon copied. We're gonna obliterate these islands on the Pacific. We just gonna wipe them all out.
But you're right, Derek.
And it's a whole
There
warfare.
is no moral, there is no concept of just war
It's
in
nuclear.
the nuclear age.
It's just
You're absolutely
if you
right.
can't disintegrate the population, that you ain't even trying to say I'm gonna control your temperature because you just eliminating this whole. I'm gonna use the word masses because now we really know what mass means. You know, it's not like a mass like in physics. You know, it's the mass, and then I usually converted it to the people. The mass in physics is really the equation for people because that's the figure I'm looking at. It's not like a mass that you use for. I'm trying to wing out some section on people so I can sectionally destroy them.
Right.
But the mass that I use is like they're using the Catholic mass, that you gotta have that mass put in language like that so that we can say, I'm saying this is a human mass and not, it's MASS, but it's still
Right.
part of what we doing.
Right. It has to be qualified.
It's a great, huh?
It
Yeah.
has to be qualified.
To put it at this table here. You know, so don't think no one is not really observing. They might be, I call it in Carlisle, they super observing observation to see if students like ourselves can be effective. Even we in the Church of the Advocate, can we be an effective nucleus? We're not a think tank, an effective nucleus. That's what she used the word organism or organic. Can we reach them with our kind of feelings?
That's right.
And Tony said, bring it then. Because we can't do nothing but humbly. He used the word with me, humbly bring. I'm not arrogantly bring it. So our content got to be like King said. Where we sitting is where we reside. Is where we walking. That's our residence. And where we walk and march together. That's where we live.
That's right.
And we don't have to give up because y'all have. I call y'all. I was awoke too. I was like, no one's gonna let you go back to sleep once you wake up. Tony got y'all on the clock with a bell. Wake up, cause don't go back to sleep.
Y'all awoke.
Y'all is woke. I'm sorry, ain't no go back to sleep.
Just trying to go to sleep.
But let me call on Nathan. Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was just a thing about the white people again. But,
Speak up a little.
I said, I guess it was just a thing about the white people
Don't get
again.
no tissues for 'em.
Oh yeah, no, but just yeah, I mean they have definitely been humiliated. I mean that's what like Kensington has shown us, and that's what all of I guess critical race theory and just like the destruction of like white people's history that they could look back on, like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, because like in Abraham Lincoln like you find like the values of like white people, like they call them honest Abe, so there's just something to be returned to.
Some truth. It's truth. It's honest truth. Tony got honest truth. If he didn't, I wouldn't be here sitting with him, Joe. Somebody got to have some honest truth in him. Everybody don't like to carry it around because they're gonna get targeted 24, 24.
But you know something, but you know something, Derek?
Yeah.
We stood when it wasn't always comfortable
Right.
to stand up.
Right.
And, you know, I think the best thing, the most beautiful thing is to, in a storm of controversy, when everybody is going the opposite way, to just stand up for what is true or what is right.
Yeah.
You feel, I mean, you know, it's never a deficit to stand for principle. It's never a deficit. I mean, I think it makes you so much stronger. It doesn't diminish you at all, you know? I mean, sometimes you can lose a job.
Yeah, I lost a job.
Well, let's
quite a
talk
few.
about that. But, you know, since we're talking about, sometimes you lose a husband or wife.
Go.
That's an easy loss to me, man. I mean, unless you know, your mortgage is tied up together. But I mean,
You have to have solidarity with your family.
but you got to have solidarity with the truth,
Yeah.
and that was, you know, I learned that from Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
But maybe we have some comments, Emily.
Yeah, Todd Doherty, when we were talking about Ukraine and Hunter Biden's connection to Ukraine, he says Hunter Biden, John Kerry's stepson, and George Soros are allegedly involved in the labs.
Crooks.
Oh, in those labs, yes.
And then Daryl Waistline says crying wolf until finally someone decided to buy the threat. Yeah. And actually there was apparently when Xi Jinping was talking to Biden, he used this Chinese saying where he said, "He who hangs the bell and the cat must retrieve it. Must be the one who retrieves it."
Now, explain what that means.
I was talking about
Right
if
there.
you're the U.S. in the U.S. empire, if you're the one who
Who's
hung the
ringing,
bell on
right.
Russia, on Putin, and all of that, now you have to be the one to retrieve
go
the bell.
get-
Go
yeah.
get it.
You
Yeah.
got yourself into this mess.
You got yourself, yeah.
You have to
Get yourself out of there. That's crazy.
It's so interesting that, I don't know whether he said it right after or right before, but he said to Biden, "You always say to me one thing, and then after our conversation, your government does the very opposite." You know, which was, again, like him saying in effect that you all don't want to take any responsibility for the messes that you create, and then you'll look people like myself in the face and say one thing and do the very opposite. Oh, go ahead, Nori.
Yeah, I think part of it is the total delusion of the American rules-based order, where everything is unilateral. The U.S. gets to at every single moment decide what is happening and what is true, and I think it really is a pretty big break from the long history of nations or states going to war with one another. Because I think when you brought up the idea of just war and unjust war, these ideas have been thought through and discussed and debated, I think, for a really long time. But there are certain principles where I feel nations respect or acknowledge one another, that each of them has certain rights or at least certain capacities, and that you actually have to recognize that and take that into account. And that in some ways war, although there's a moral dimension, the connection to diplomacy and I guess the will of the people, all of those are things that you need to take into account. But yeah, I was just thinking about it, and it feels with World War I and World War II, in the 20th century, all of the classic ideas of war had broken down, where they were generally limited, and then I think that along with the development of nuclear technology really brought things to a point where there was greater interdependence. And so I think with that, it seems to make sense to me that if you have all of these technological developments, shouldn't you also have greater philosophical or ideological developments to come up with more sophisticated ideas of war and of peace, and why peace is so important. And I feel that was partially what was coming up in the Bandung Conference in '55, which were all of the Asian and African nations coming together and saying look, we know how devastating war is. It's reached a pinnacle that we've never seen before, and we should never get to this point ever again. And so they're proposing greater cooperation, economic cooperation, but also like the element of, I guess, like spiritual or like even ideological understanding and mutual respect, which I feel like that was a huge contribution to the world. But I was just thinking about the need for that because it feels like in the last like 50, 70 years, there's been like a suppression or an attack on those ideas. And it even reminded me of, I guess, when you were talking about like quantum physics and that break and the fact that like those questions are not resolved. Like you can't just lay the debate to rest and say like, oh, it's done, like we've already figured it all out. But then seeing even how like these questions of physics go, like they bleed over into philosophy, but they also, I think, have been, I guess, used for war, like whether for military technology or even ideologically. And so I feel like, yeah, part of, I guess, what I'm feeling is that that King quote about how we've gotten so far with like military and technological progress, but not moral progress. And that does lead back to like the need for ideas. And I feel like it's been like a dual thing, which is that you only build up like the military and then you suppress the philosophical. And then you end up with like this delusional place where all of the war propaganda is not really based on ideas or even like the principles that have been in place for so long.
But you know, 2 generations, maybe going on 3 generations of university students have experienced each generation a more empty, a more barren, impoverished education. And I could not agree with you more that once you eliminate philosophy because philosophy is not just philosophy or what we think of as philosophers. It encompasses the whole range of humanistic studies. Once you take that out of it, what are you teaching people? What are you preparing them to be? How do they model their lives? You know, how do they imagine their lives if all of that is unimportant? And you kick, like you say, kick the can down the road. Or all of those problems have been solved and we don't, go ahead, Noria.
Yeah, because I think also with, I guess, this nuclear or total war is that before I think the question was like, you might win this war, but victory at what price? Like, what is the price?
Yeah.
But I feel like what's pretty strange about this war is that nobody's asking like, what is the price of this victory? Like, is it worth going to war in the first place? What is it going to cost us? Instead, it's just like, oh, like, you know, America's right. We have to defend democracy. So at whatever cost, whether that's escalation to like nuclear war.
Well, the discourse was that the total cost would fall on Russia as we set them up for regime change. You know what I'm saying? And we want to punish them so much so that we bring their government down. If we could, we would try to assassinate Putin like we did Muammar Gaddafi. You know what I'm saying? That's how cold-blooded they are. But then it's, and you're right about this, and this is something we were talking about, I think, the last time. This does reflect a school of philosophy, not a major school, but a minor school connected to American pragmatism, which in some ways goes back to English empiricism. It reflects a school of philosophy as it is manifested in an ideology. And, you know, one of the things is that it is so empty and so barren that no one really believes in it. You know?
Yeah. So that's
what
why
I'm saying.
But I feel like that's what makes it such a useful ideology.
Absolutely.
Like the pragmatism of it, which is that you just put it where you need to put it in order to achieve your objectives.
Yes. Wow. Yeah. And you know, like they talk, they talk about, I knew there was a professor at Temple named Joe Margolis, very fine person, but he had this theory of pragmatism without foundations. Now, whenever you hear that without foundations, without grounding, you're in trouble. You know what I'm saying? I don't know whether we won't get a lot into it, but that without, you see, one of the things that makes Kant important is that he was thinking with foundation, that reason occurs on certain assumptions, certain foundations, certain grounding. You know what I'm saying? And that goes for ethical thinking, that goes for scientific thinking. Once you say, I can proceed without grounding, without foundation, you know what I'm saying? So therefore, it's hard to even enter into a discussion with a person because it goes nowhere. Because if you say something, well, I'd like to know, what are the foundations? What are your assumptions that lead to that assertion? Well, I don't have foundations. You know, I think without foundations, my moral claims are without grounding. It's only a matter of the moment, the immediate. And this is a little bit Hegel. The immediate and the mediate. The immediate is the initial perception. The mediate, M-E-D-I, however you spell it, is thinking through a grounding, through fundamental assumptions. Now you get Nazism. It is moral thinking where the foundation is, quote, my civilization. Take war, this kind of war. I don't have to justify it in moral foundations. It's my interest.
Right.
I mean, this is hugely grotesque. I guess sometimes I make these faces because it's so grotesque. And people who think like this are really grotesque. I remember I said something about how ugly Hillary Clinton had become, and a lady commented, well, why are you making that comment about women and so on and so forth? I wasn't thinking that way. I wasn't talking that way. You have a grotesque philosophy. It's going to show. It is going to show. And these are grotesque people because I just want to say, I don't want to talk to you. Think without or through assumptions. Don't just tell me what you want to say. You know, that's on the street. I can go to anybody. No, I ain't going, you know. That's like the law of the jungle. That's the brute. I said it, so what? Yeah. F you. You understand? It's my interest. You know? The mediation, as it were, is my interest. And that's why it gets connected up, Anna, to political theorizing. And, you know, I haven't worked it all out. And I would definitely welcome your help in this, Anna. John Locke and the British empiricist school, the empiricist school, Hume and so on, where the only important thing is the immediate. The immediate. But like Kant said, and certainly Hegel, we are capable of reason. Hence, what we experience is mediated through our reason. You know what I'm saying? Not just our interest. Can you see the grotesqueness, where that leads to, that interest thing, that individualist thing? It is hard to be a moral human being and proceed that way. Now you can, set up some boundaries. You know what I'm saying? Maybe society through its legal system will set up boundaries. So whether you think it through or not, or whether you internalize assumptions of right and wrong, etc., society through the state will make sure you don't go too far one way or the other. That's Hobbes, by the way. But that ain't it. See, this is why you get, I don't want to talk too much, but this is when you get like, and I'm using Kant as the example here, that it can't just be externally imposed, as in the state and law. It has to come from an organic foundation where we fully allow for the fullest development of reason, hence mediation. We'll get, I know it don't all make sense right away, but we'll get more into that,
Go ahead.
Well, we have two more comments, and then I think Kathy, you want to say something?
Something really brief.
Daniel Lee Eisenberg Jacobs has a long comment, but I think it's related to what Derek was also saying about in the nuclear age. How does that, in the nuclear age, with technological developments, like how does that change the St. Augustine just and unjust war? But he says, I think NATO is culpable for aggression, has destabilized the world, and has lied. I think Putin has been driven to negotiate with NATO vis-a-vis the conflict in Ukraine and did not want to do this. Putin would much rather negotiate with Trump. The latter's absence has destabilized the world.
That's true.
However, I have to comradely add, and I think this is in response to what you were saying, Doc, earlier about World War, how actually it's not a world war. The World War III topic.
That's right. Yeah, I would moderate that. Yeah, but I'm
Okay,
sorry.
Yeah, in some ways I think he might be disagreeing or trying to poke at some of what you were saying there. He says, on the one hand, you said that a war between NATO and Russia would not be a world war. On the other hand, you mentioned that people would from economically dependent countries are bullied by Western powers. That means that a war between NATO and Russia could become a world war because they would pull in other countries, including if a country was to resist. You have mentioned the abstention votes at the UN. That is what would make it a world war, not if every country was diplomatically involved or voted to go to war. A world war could be started by one country, for example, the US. I think, however, what Marjorie Taylor Greene represents is the war wariness that was a major predictor of Trump's election.
Absolutely.
And so it is a defining split between Trump and the establishment right now.
Yep. Yeah.
The issue with the appeal to just and unjust wars is the socialization of production since St. Augustine's time. There is a different juridical and economic system since his theorization of what counts as just. This crosses over national boundaries. There are Ukrainian property interests protected by Russia and Russian property interests being destroyed in the war in Ukraine. In this case, military operations were technically launched by Russia first, but we recognize it as defensive because we recognize the standing army encircling Russia. All of the West is condemning Russia on the basis of St. Augustine, but we recognize something beyond what is official international law. Determining who is culpable at the national level, which nation attacks first, avoids this or is insufficient. The socialization of property, characteristic of capitalism. And then he ends with a Lenin quote. Hence, Lenin can say, quote, that is why it is equally absurd to blame the capitalists of one or another country. All they are to blame for is for having introduced such a system, but this has been done in full keeping with the law, which is safeguarded by all the forces of a civilized state. I am fully within my rights. I am a buyer of shares. All the law courts, all the police, the whole standing army, and all the navies in the world are safeguarding my sacred right to these shares. Who's to blame for banks being set up which handle hundreds of millions of rubles? For these banks casting their nets of plunder over the whole world, and for their being locked in mortal combat. Find the culprit if you can. End quote.
Wow.
A few more short comments, and I think that's it for now. Todd
Who is
Doherty-
this?
I'm just reading the remaining short comments. Todd Doherty says, as she would say, win-win and not the zero-sum game. Stephen Palmier says, war for war's sake, resources be damned. And then lastly, this is an interesting comment, talking about Marjorie Greene Taylor and also the black politicians. Kwame Madden says, that's what's wrong with most of our black politicians. They refuse to stand for truth. So they choose the route of careerism.
Right.
Not to say only black has to be the ones, but we do have a tradition of being truth tellers.
That's right.
Yeah.
I want to say hi to Kwame, long friend. You know, hey Kwame, and anybody, I'm going to do an interview with Black Agenda Radio, which is resuming its work on, I think I'm doing it on Monday with Margaret Kimberly, on the question of the black woman Judge Brown, who is being has been nominated to the Supreme Court. And I am completely underwhelmed, unimpressed, and it means absolutely nothing to the struggle for freedom. It's an empty symbol of a ruling class that is trying to fight for legitimacy. In fact, I guess I'm telling y'all what my interview is going to be. But I said, Serafina asked me, I didn't want to tell her, but I did tell her. The American Supreme Court is analogous to the British royal family. Ritual. There's no substance. And I said, just, I got to tell her whole interview now. But, you know, between 1896 and 1954, the Supreme Court did nothing significant. Nothing. It was just a bunch of white men, you know, parading around and acting like, or symbolizing, quote, the rule of law. A symbol of the rule of law, as though law governed the society and not power and all of that. And if you think about it, from 1973, Roe versus Wade, up till today, the Supreme Court has been absolutely useless, meant nothing to the people. So these appointments don't mean a damn thing. And anybody that wants to associate it with black progress, they don't want black progress at all. But I just want to respond, if you don't mind, to Danny on, see, I think, yes, in the 20th century, there were two more or less world wars. Now, the reason we could call them world wars is because one of the major features of those wars were the colonies. And don't forget that most of the world was colonized. And China's war was both a war against the Japanese invaders and for national independence, which meant that it was a struggle against colonialism and foreign occupation. But the major powers who fought the war were in fact fighting a war for hegemony, which meant colonial imperial hegemony. Even if there's a war, and I would ask Danny to respond, even if there is a war, and I don't think there will be, by the way, between Russia and NATO, you could call it a European war. The world will be concerned. Most of the world will support Russia in one or another way. But it will not be a world war. Now, people will say, or to expand it to a world war, that anything that Europeans do, just like they refer to the international community has isolated Russia. That ain't the way it's happened. The international community ain't did nothing. They're still trading with Russia. They're using whatever. But it is this egotism of a dying empire, of a civilization in crisis, where they associate the world with themselves. You know, you remember that song, "We are the world, we are the children"? No, you're not the world and you're not the children. Get over it. Since you're supposed to be so woke these days, you know what I'm saying? But we are the world. That was Michael. But see, I think we are in a moment of a change of epochs. And like Nori said, the United States constantly want to use this rules-based. Well, whose rules? Some shit you made up?
Right.
We want a rules-based world. And then somebody said, no, we want a laws-based world. Based on international law, the UN Charter, and the law that flows from that. Not some shit that you gonna come in here and impose and we all got the rules-based. Oh, you know, no, man, that ain't happening. So excuse me for cursing, we are in a change of, I can say epochs, or if you want me to be cute, epochs.
It is.
It's a change, and it is a fundamental change. And so, what is the world is not the European conception of the world. And I'm certain that India doesn't see the world in that way. I know that China doesn't. Korea doesn't. I mean, well, I'm trying to figure out, well, who does? Germany? Britain? People still try to say great. It's not great. It's Britain being whittled down to just England. Because the rest of the people trying to break camp with them. But who are these people? It is not the world.
No, I don't think so.
Oh, go ahead, Jerry.
Well, just as brief comment, but it reminds me of the world in Africa, where Du Bois starts with the collapse of Europe to describe the World War. Or at least
This is very important. This is very important. And yeah, just this idea, you know, the world in the first chapter, the collapse of Europe. The collapse of Europe. And of course the dialectic is that dialectically the collapse of Europe meant the liberation of humanity.
Right.
Now that was 1946. Everything doesn't happen overnight. It is a process. And I think we're at the end of a process. And that's why the ideological struggle is so important. And the struggle for ideological clarity among young people.
Yes.
And universities are committed to guaranteeing that ideologically and spiritually young people are left empty. Yeah. And that is why universities are places where suicides and depression are more pronounced than happiness and excitement about their lives. And you know, you go to an elite university, everybody's trying to find out where's the drug man at? Jesus. You know what I'm saying? Where can I get some weed? Yes, I mean, let's keep it real. I mean, you know, spring break down in Florida. Everybody's on fentanyl. You know, I'm partying hardy. I'm free at last. It is because I can't, you know, hold on 1 minute. You know, as I look at it, 2.5 generations who have been under this kind of spiritual and ideological, ruthless attack, and these bums are going to stand up here and point their fingers at other civilizations and look at what they have wrought on their own people, even the most privileged of them? Come on. This is outrageous. outrageous. This, and it was done willfully. And it's nothing worse than to lie to young people. That's one of the great sins. Because young people are looking up most of the time. From children to y'all, you're always looking up to mentors, to, role models, whatever. And when all of those people you look up to do nothing but lie or tell half the truth, who can easily abandon you in the middle of the street, it's just, see, once you throw down with young people, it puts, I feel it, a tremendous responsibility on your shoulders. You can't, it's not, you betray young people, you do anything. And these no good universities and these bum ass professors, who feel nothing, who believe in nothing, who are more concerned with themselves. Yeah, there's a reason students are depressed, and they should be. That's the only normal reaction, depression. Only thing I say, you need to come to the free school. That's all, the help. Go ahead, Derek. Hold on, let me let Anna come in, because she hasn't spoken. And Kathy. Anna first and then Kathy.
Oh yeah, no, I was just, actually, I had been going through my notes, my old notes from like my political theory classes, because I was like thinking about what you were saying, like what you and Nuri were talking about, and I was like, they had to have said something about, like empiricism and Locke, but they didn't.
They did not.
No, they didn't. First of all, they never talk about Hegel. Well, and that's the thing, is that like, I was going through some of like my, like they call it modern political thought, which is like just, a couple of Western Europeans and Americans. And then I also was looking through like the theory parts of like American foreign policy. And even when they would get into like the theory parts, yeah, just what you were saying, they're really, the way it's presented, like it's very obtuse. Like it's very, like, okay, we got our realists, we got our, okay, well, so what does realist mean? Okay, it means something about like defending our interests.
What does it mean?
I don't think I even got down something coherent.
But I'd like to come back to, that's a very important thing, realism versus neoconservatism.
Well, but the thing is, I don't think they even put that, like, for like, they didn't put those two in dichotomy. Well, that's the thing, because it was, I just remember like writing about how like it didn't make sense. Like they would, because what happens is, I wanted to add that like what these like classes have in common, they really like to push this narrative of like this notion of providence, or like city on a hill, right? They say that when the first Puritan settlers came to this country, they saw, okay, this is like Jerusalem, this is the new Jerusalem, city on a hill. And they like to follow that thread throughout this country's political thought and history. I don't know exactly what purpose it serves. I'm sure it does serve a pretty specific purpose. But the fact that it doesn't actually hit on the actual like material developments that have caused like our foreign policy, or the ideology behind like a lot of what we do. Which is another thing, they don't talk about ideology. They always say, oh, our interests, what are interests? Well, they never answer that. So I think I actually ended up concentrating in political theory because I was curious about like the framework, why are things the way they are? How do we make our decisions? But just like the philosophy department, they don't actually answer those questions. I wish I had something more coherent to say. Maybe I would have to go through my notes a little more thoroughly. But yeah, I was looking through them because I was thinking like they had to have talked about something. I was trying to remember something, but
they probably did, but they didn't make it clear. If I might just suggest, I don't know whether this will. I know, you see, when they talk about realism, they actually go back to Machiavelli.
Right.
Yes.
And although Machiavelli has gotten a bad rap lately, you know, when somebody does something without principle or, you know, just kind of, they can say, oh, he's really Machiavellian, you know. But Machiavelli's was a theory of the state
Yeah.
and the way the state should behave and the moral boundaries of the state, how it defines its interests and so on. But realism is based upon interest. But how do you construct or consider interest? That's a whole nother question. And that debate came up during the war in Vietnam time. And I don't know whether they mentioned Hans Morgenthau.
Yeah. Oh, vaguely, yeah.
Yeah, well, he was, at that time, and he was a German who immigrated here and became very famous, but he was the, one of the great people arguing against the war in Vietnam from a realist point of view. The guy that does it today is a man by the name of John Mersheimer
Yeah.
at the University of Chicago.
Yeah.
And I give him all due respect because he's made it unequivocally clear
Yes.
that this war is the fault of the United States.
Yes.
They have been pushing this
Yeah.
for some blah. But yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna add with Machiavelli that what's interesting is he actually was very pro like the people. He like defines societies in two classes. You have the elite and the populace.
Yes.
And he said that the leader should actually be accountable to the populace
Yes.
and not the elite because, you know, he says that the elite are just power hungry and if you keep catering to them, it actually comes to the detriment of the populace, which is where your authority actually comes from. And I think like Machiavelli even wrote, you know, like The Prince and a lot of what he
Yes.
did because he
Yes.
wanted to actually unify Italy, which was just like a mosaic of like small city-states at the time.
Yes.
And he actually wanted to bring peace to the entire peninsula.
Yeah. And go ahead. I'm sorry, Kath.
Well, I've been thinking this whole time just because I've been flashing back to this one interview I saw briefly on Fox News between Tulsi Gabbard and Sean Hannity, and actually this conversation has really helped me reinterpret or help me better understand it just because it relates a lot to this question around like establishing interest and like really being able to even like seek truth from facts in some ways because basically the whole thing was that Sean Hannity wanted to bring on Tulsi Gabbard because of her opposition to the war in Ukraine. And I know we're a little bit past that conversation. I don't mean to draw it back to that, but it feels like, it was the first time I think I was really seeing a lot of what we're talking about in action and recognizing it where Sean Hannity just wanted to get Tulsi Gabbard to sort of admit to the world that like she was of the position that we should not send weapons to Ukraine. He kept pushing and pushing her but she held her ground. She's like, you're missing my point. What we really need to do is to like answer this. We go into war because we've usually established an objective that aligns with our interests and we find the best method to carry that out. And unfortunately in this situation we just haven't done so. And we just haven't even been able, it just reminded me so much of what Nuri and Doug, you were just sort of talking about like how come nobody is asking like what the price of victory would be on the people, on humanity, and she just wanted to, I mean even that opportunity to reflect that back to the public on TV was really helpful to even see, and she just kept pushing like, you're missing my point, I don't want us to get carried away into this conversation about like why is it like it's immoral for America not to send weapons, it's immoral for America not to oppose this dictatorial invasion of Ukraine. We really need to be asking like the fundamental questions and establishing this objective first. And I mean, it felt really like Hegelian for her to sort of just go back to this like we need to establish a method for determining what is truthful and what is our objective and what is our best interest. And I know there's a deeper connection here between especially all this political theory and unjust and just war. I'm just still sort of like piecing it together, but I do think there's something deeply aligning with all of this. And,
No, I think what you're doing is what we're doing here, and this is why philosophy is politics by other means. And so you have to take, like you're taking that encounter between Tulsi Gabbard, who one has to consider a consistent advocate for peace, so much so that she's had to abandon the Democratic Party because it is the party, although the Republicans are too, but the Democrats are really the party of war. So her encountering Sean Hannity and his bombacity and demagogy in times like this, all kinds of demagogues, a demagogue, somebody just run off at the mouth and tries to seize the platform in a time of war, especially when they think they're gonna win. That's what you get with the Sean Hannitys, this, what's his name, the congressman from South Carolina.
Lindsey Graham.
I can't remember these people.
He's not
What's the one?
I don't know.
Lindsey Graham. Yeah. Yeah. Liz Cheney. They're just demagogues, and they come and go. Whenever they think they're going to win, they get real. They get a lot of heart. We need to go in and assassinate Putin. Well, why don't you lead the pack since you want to do that?
run the back.
You're not going to do anything. But that's the demagogue. So Tulsi Gabbard was up against a demagogue, right? So how does she argue for reason or a rational construction of national interest against a demagogue who all he wants to do is talk louder than you and talk more forcefully than you do? And that's a difficult thing. But for us, it is an instance of something deeper than just the encounter. Because I would say, and then you tell me what you think about this, Kathy, that Sean Hannity is, he's just deteriorating. He can't even, hard to look at. But his thing is that our national interest is in being the world's bully, the world's policeman, the world's hegemon. That's what, and if we show weakness, this is another part of their argumentation, the strength and weakness thing. That we cannot appear to be weak, even though we are weak, and even though Sean Hannity and them know that we are very weak, and even though people who study the U.S. military knows that it's not an adequate fighting force, that it's more, quote, woke than it is a military force. Everybody knows that. But Sean Hannity is, we cannot appear weak and against an authoritarian like Putin. But here's where the balloon is going to be punctured and all the air is going to go out. And he'll be just another idiot. The West will lose. The United States, who provoked all of this, will be least hurt. Although we're going to be hurt, we're already being hurt. Europe is going to be totally devastated. And, when you talk about Europe, it's not just one thing. You got, East Europe, East Central Europe. You got like Germany, which is an economic powerhouse, France, kind of. But then you got countries like Greece and Spain and Portugal. They're not on the level of even a country like Singapore, city-state. They're very, very weak. The only claim to anything that they have, we're a member of the European Union, we're European. So in other words, it's a wage for whiteness. to use Du Bois's thing. I might be poor, I might be out of work, I might be hungry, but at least I'm white. So that's Portugal, Greece, Spain to a certain extent, you know. But then Germany is going to, and that's what the Prime Minister said. So I just say all of that to say that, how could I put, it's a situation where the West went into this following the United States, but they cannot win. They're losing as we speak, and they're losing what is being called the economic war of attrition. Another way to the long economic war. And once, you know, it now turns out that Russia was doing them a favor by remaining in some kind of relationship with Western Europe, you know, providing 50% or more of their natural gas and oil and coal and energy, you know. Now you take that out, and once the dollar and the euro are no longer the central currencies, and they force Western Europe to deal with Russia using the the ruble. So I don't. Maybe somebody else can see a way out, a win for the. I don't see. Even if NATO got involved in Poland or something like that, it would then the Russians would then. It would no longer be a soft war. They would then go into hard war, and Poland would suffer tremendously. Bulgaria, Romania, definitely. But I'll say, yeah. But could you say something?
Well, I'm still collecting my thoughts just because I feel like I'm still thinking this through, or like it's one just really exciting. Like it's just actually something I don't think. These are not really terms I'm used to thinking in, especially political theory, but I feel like just thanks to free school and just being able to talk through this every day and, you know, have a grounding in ideas like Hegel and even, and philosophy in this time has been really helpful. And yeah, actually that is one thing that Chelsea did say. One of the first things she did say was like, objectively there's no way the West can win this. So every time we send something, it's just going to, we're just prolonging something that we're already, you know, imminently facing. And I mean, it goes back to, I'm jumping, but I feel like it's exciting that we're getting to talk in these terms, because I feel like as the ruling class sort of has its own game that it plays and manipulates, like we're able to win when we're getting at the basis of assumptions. We're able to win if we have like the ideological strong hand. And that's what I appreciate about free school.
That's right. You can't. I mean, look. This is not. How do you say? A pastime. These discussions are as important as breathing. You just can't live. You know, just like, you know, it's just like you see people walking around, breathing on they got a tank and all that. Well, that's analogous to people who are ideologically disabled. It's like one lung ain't working right. You know what I'm saying? And they got to have what do they call it? Oxygen tank. This is not a luxury. This is a necessity. And until this is normalized more widely, that is, the struggle for ideological clarity, to know the world in order to change the world, unless this becomes normalized in the lives of growing parts of young people. We here, I'm not talking about Russia, Ukraine, we here face what King called spiritual death. You can't, You can't keep kicking these questions down the road. I don't care whether it's, quantum mechanics or just and unjust wars, or what is the human, or what what? My sexuality is more primary than this? No. No. Humanity is first. And I'm not going to be no moral policeman of the whole world. Either you do it my way or I'm going to condemn you as backward. Chinese going to do it. The Koreans are going to do it their way. Everybody has their own path to freedom, to democracy. That's the beauty of humanity. That's what Derek is saying. I want to know every person's civilization. And Kathy, that's what's so beautiful about the free school. I know just being around people from other civilizations has made me a better person. I love it. And go ahead, Derek.
So I was sitting here, the way how the framers, you can't take these words passively. The framers is something that incorporates everything. You know what I mean? We think about the framers of the Constitution, but it's something more that meets the eye once you say something is upon being framed. It's not the negative. I framed you for some crimes, okay? That's a real negative usage of the word for the framers. And the importance of the framers and the importance of physics, you can't even maneuver yourself without the ingredients in the physics, which in the free school, as far as my participation and my coming and going, it's like this physics can't be withheld from the elementary process that I've put my own being through, because it's something about the framers being able to converse worldwide at some points, and then sometimes they conserve themselves right here in Philadelphia and expanding on things we sitting at this table here trying to wrestle with. Can we develop the philosophy from different other times, and so they had to go through other centuries and find something that could better represent something, even if they thought they wasn't the optimum part of it, because this was just the beginning. Like Ho Chi Minh is the beginning of the democracy, or Sun Yat-sen. It was something that they got from the original founders, but because they were still students from the heart, and they had courage to face their own strange. We all have strange ideas in our mind until we can get some perfection in our home qualities about what it is to be a human being every day, and not cuss everybody and don't laugh with everybody, because it's not a fun game to try to live among humanity. This is a real elegant world here, but it can be a brutal throwdown.
Yeah, and this practice of looking down on people and laughing, mocking and turning great civilizations into cartoon characters.
That's what Russia in the United States, since it took a lot of air out of us in this society, I couldn't have a book on Russia. I got encyclopedias. Yeah. The things that we had to learn from other people is not to denigrate other human beings. But that's the main thing that I've seen, that Americans, they don't care who they talk about. Even the people they think that they with you.
Yeah.
And they
see, I'm gonna show you something. Like with Marjorie Taylor Greene. See, what she is going through her own dialectical process of growth.
Okay. Yes.
She is discovering a humanity in her that she didn't even realize was there. Yeah. Because when you stand up, it transforms you. Because just like you said, Kathy, about Tulsi Gabbard, to
Yeah.
have to put up with a loudmouth like Sean Hannity, knows very little but can shout you down, or Marjorie Taylor Greene, when she's been drugged through the sewer of the American media, she will come out of this a greater person and a great person, I think. And I'm like Nathan. There will be many more who will go through this. This is, see, in a period of transition and reconfiguring of world history, a great power like the United States, who has been at the helm, at the forefront of modernity. If the world changes and America tries to resist the change, there will be people, prophetic figures, I'm not saying Marjorie Taylor Greene, but something like her, who will come forward and say, no, we have to be on the right side of history. And we're in that transformative moment. And Kathy, like, it's so great that you bring forward for our consideration that very debate. Because this is more than Marjorie Taylor and Sean Hannity, because it is representative of sides in a great national debate that we're going through right now. Go ahead, Jerry.
So I guess I'm trying to think well, try to think well with physics, because you can't. It's something that has to be on the table repeatedly if you want to have something that you can understand with it. Not we waiting around for some other physicist to walk through this door here, and I put a blackboard up. I say, well, I'm gonna put some of the first ones that I learned how to put back in. It's like a transcript. I had to try to transcribe how I write to go for computer interpretation. I'm not saying I'm overthinking what a physicist does. You have to be in your human mode. Mm-hmm. They've taken these other young people with Oppenheimer, and they have taken them and utilized them, not that they understood the burden of humanity being slaughtered. It was their awakening at the same presence, like a simultaneously consciousness, awareness that they get ready to kill millions of people with this.
Right.
Because you got war manufacturers walking in your like if they came in here walking through here, and I don't have maps on the table, but I've tried to bring something that we're looking at, but somebody can walk and say, oh my gosh, we can use that, we can use them. And they utilizing young people and their vision of the world,
or
and
lack of a vision. Or,
yes.
You see, the dropping of the atomic bomb was an assertion of, quote, national interest. We didn't have to drop that bomb or those bombs, but we're going to assert our national interest and saying that from this point going forward, not only do we have 75% of the gold in the world, but we have the most destructive weapons that no one else has. This was a dangerous moment. And this is why Du Bois and others stood up against it. But it is science, quote, and I'm like you, it's not science, it is, quote, science. It is an imitation of science, science without philosophy. Science without a moral grounding. Science without humanity being seen in it. Let me let Jerry come in, Jerry.
No, I just, well, even like those, when the media, like they bring people like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Tulsi Gabbard up, and there was also an interview with the Chinese ambassador to the US recently, where he was brought on, and they're like, why can't you condemn Russia? And then like you realize they all use the same script.
But that
Like
was so terrible of that woman, the interviewer, to talk to that man.
They talk down on him.
Yeah, and he, English is not his first language, although he spoke it well, but it was a little, and just vicious
Right.
for this little white pipsqueak. And you,
Oh, wow.
I mean, it was, am I lying?
No, yeah.
Just a nothing, a zero.
Right,
To talk to that man in that way,
right.
and just like, but see, it's Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken all over again. It gives all these little white people permission to look down on a representative. And after all, that's what he is, the ambassador of China to the United States. He represents a nation of 1.4 billion people, a civilization that's 5,000 years old. Like they say, put some respect on his name. You gonna disrespect that man? Who are you? But see, this is the time of day it is. If I might just say, they're losing. And now the process of loss, the velocity of it, is going to speed up.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to cut you off.
Well, it just reminded me of there was like a pamphlet that Du Bois wrote, I think in 1951, called "Peace is Dangerous," where he says that, like, he concludes, he's like talking about McCarthyism and
Yes.
the drive for war in the U.S. and how dangerous it's becoming, and he says, a silence has fallen on the soul of this nation.
Say that again.
A silence has fallen on the soul of this nation, and I don't know. It's just crazy to read that in Du Bois saying that in 1950, and then to also go forward a few years to King saying there's a time to break silence, and it gives it a new meaning because it's almost like he's talking about, as others have said, like, what does it mean for the soul of this country to be suppressed, for the logical development
That's
of
interesting. Go, keep talking.
yeah, like for the logical development of the spirit of the people, for that to be suppressed. And you know, part of what I think people like, whether it's Marjorie Taylor Greene or Tulsi Gabbard, but you see, it's like, there comes a time again where like you have to break the silence of not just like, you know, like what we typically think of like speaking out, but more so of like the expanding nature of like what the American like people can be and like what their spirits can be. And it was just interesting that Du Bois saw like McCarthyism and this insane cultural like climate and like this ideological climate, like he saw that as a suppressing of like what America's potential was. But now you see how that like you can't maintain that forever, basically.
That is so very important. Oh, go ahead. Emil, I'll let you answer.
No.
It was one letter.
Hold on, wait a minute.
Okay.
This concept of the suppression of the soul of the nation. I'd like for you to, you know, if you could send me that that pamphlet. I'm familiar with it, I think, but see, this is why we live probably in the most undemocratic country in the world. Because the regime cannot exist except through the suppression of the soul of the people and the distortion of the people. What do I mean by distortion? And this is what Serafina and I talk about a lot: the imposition of an anti-human pop culture upon the people. This is unnatural. This culture is unnatural. What they're feeding, as King said, into the veins of a normally humane people. Remember, he put it that way: war propaganda being injected into the veins of a normally humane people. And this is frankly what we're up against as the free schoolers, you know. But there are more opportunities now to make gains it is, it is in a sense what you would have to call tragic. The state, in a lot of ways, the situation American people of all races and languages find themselves in is really tragic. They didn't, it's not their fault, they would want otherwise. They have been misled by those who they thought were their leaders, you know what I'm saying? There's no two ways about it. And, 2 generations now have had injected into their veins, this propaganda of war and anti-humanism, hatred. And so, in a lot of ways, the nation will have to reap the whirlwind. We'll have to go through all of this to get through it. We'll have to go the painful struggle of rediscovering what is humane about this nation. You dig where I'm coming from?
Yeah.
And it ain't gonna be done in these universities. These are hollowed out, empty institutions of self-promotion and money-making, kleptocracy, In other words, I'm a professor not to find the truth, but I'm a professor because I want to get paid, all of that. So, yeah. But I think, I don't know why, but I feel I feel optimistic. And you all are the vanguard, the embryo of the future. I remember I made the statement that the young people of the free school are capable of governing a city like Philadelphia. And somebody wrote a statement, who used to be in the free school, saying that was an outlandish statement. Well, what is outlandish about it? I mean, do you see who's running things now? At least we couldn't do any worse. And the fact, yeah. I mean, look, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, party girl, Anthony Blinken, that other one that looked like the movie from Halloween with the machete. The guy looks, okay, I don't want to comment.
Don't do it.
Okay, the guy ain't good looking, so that's not his fault. He couldn't determine. But the guy don't look right. But anyway, if people like ourselves shy away from the fact that people like us and us will at some point be called upon to lead the people. And, the Du Boisian concept of leadership as the guiding 100th, but the Du Boisian concept is that you lead through knowledge. You don't lead through demagogy. Part of the problem of the city of Philadelphia is that they're a bunch of bums and demagogues. And some of them are going to jail. I think the whole city council should be locked up for malfeasance and so on. But don't think that what you see around here cannot lead the people. And don't ever believe that it won't come a time where people will look to people like us to lead. And by leadership, we mean expressing the will of the people. And it's very possible because we are in that kind of transformative moment. So, I agree with you, Kathy. Being able, this is what you do. you have to know the world. You have to discuss these issues. You have to probe deeper. Sadly, we haven't had a chance to get to Hegel in a few weeks, but he's so embedded at this point in our thinking. And what his project is and was is really deeply embedded in us and how we go forward. We're always thinking about Hegel and dialectics and the law of the negation of the negation and all of that. So yeah, but the fact that we have linked philosophy to politics, and the fact that we understand that real politics is at the end of the day ideas. That's what it is. The political struggle is the struggle of ideas. It's not the struggle of some simple-ass politician. It's the struggle of ideas. And whoever wins the ideological struggle wins the future, no matter how long it takes. And sometimes you're on the outside looking in, but that's not a forever situation. There is such a thing in physics called the butterfly effect. Heard of that? Thought I was saying something new. The butterfly effect. That a butterfly flapping its wings in Argentina could have an effect upon events far away. That is what, hey Eddie, I want you to hear this. that is what in quantum mechanics they call entanglement. That things that are apparently unconnected are in fact deeply connected, although separated by vast distances. That's what we are, kind of a butterfly effect. You know? So I'll say, so maybe, let's see if we have some more comments. You sure?
I have a question.
Oh yes, please.
What's the difference between philosophy and ideology?
I knew somebody was going to. Actually, philosophy, I'll use this language, although it's not the best, is a branch of ideology. Ideology is an ology, like sociology. Ideology really is the study of ideas, their history, and their social emergences, their social connectedness. Okay? Philosophy is a part of ideology. In fact, Marx and Engels wrote a book called The German Ideology, which was in effect the study of German philosophy in the 1840s. But they called it the German ideology because, and this is very interesting, this is the good thing that we're doing. See, the fact that we have not separated philosophy from ideology, from the bigger questions of ideas in general, of the connectedness of ideas, particular moments of ideas or the history of ideas, from their connection to political and economic classes and political and economic struggles. You know what I'm saying? So ideology could be considered this overarching framework. It's what Hegel would call the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. That's what you could conceptualize ideology as. the overarching spirit of the time, the overarching ideas that frame the moment. So when we say, we were talking about the Clausewitz war is politics by other means. We said philosophy is politics by other means. It's a way of saying that philosophy is ideology by other means, or saying that politics or the political struggle is the ideological struggle. You see what I'm saying? That's where I would frame it. But Serafina, I would not ever want to leave ideology or politics out of questions of philosophy, because it don't make no sense then. It becomes this empty academic enterprise that everybody gets bored with, except the philosophy professor, who is boring to start with. Who can't even laugh unless he gets drunk. I'm telling you, man, I've been around them, man. It's a bunch of
just drink.
Now they do crack, but I'm just saying, to separate philosophy from politics is to separate philosophy from life and from history. You know what I'm saying? And that's why, you get a lot of people that say, oh, the free school is studying Hegel. Oh, they just want to talk about white philosophers. You see what I'm saying? And I'm glad they say that behind the back of the free school. And I'm glad we have this live stream and so on, so they know what we're talking about, and if you got something to say, you know where we are. But such a position is so American, even though they will claim to be the blackest of the black, the most African of the Africans. They're more African than the Africans in Africa. And I'm going to show you how to be you think I'm making this up? But it is the American imperial arrogance that puts a dashiki on. But it's the same arrogance. To dismiss what we call mediation, and to study philosophy in such a way that talks not just about the immediate representation and experience, a la modern cultural feminism. Like somebody asked me, what do you think of bell hooks? I said, well, that's another question. That's more than bell hooks. You got to ask me, what do I think about the zeitgeist that produces bell hooks? So anyone that says, well, we don't need Hegel, well, you're not saying anything that American pragmatists don't say. At their worst. You know what I'm saying? Oh, we don't need philosophy. All we need is to understand outcomes. We don't need to talk about what is called mediation or foundational thinking. You say, well, we're talking about dialectics. Oh, well, the ancient Greeks talked about that, and in fact, the ancient Greeks got it from the ancient Africans. And the ancient Africans and the ancient Chinese, they all had this sense of all things exist in a state of change. Yes, they did. But what we're talking about is modern dialectics. And we're talking about, the law of negation. That all things exist, not just in a process of movement, but all things exist as a unity of oppositions. I don't want to use the word oppositions because there might be more than two oppositions within a phenomenon. But at any point, at any rate, the law of negation. And what we're trying to discover is the law-likeness of development.
The law likeness?
Yes. In other words, when we talk about the law of negation, or we talk about a logical law, what we're talking about is a pattern that repeats itself over time. When we talk about quantity becoming quality,
Right.
quantitative changes leading to qualitative change, what we're talking about is the pattern, which we could say is a law or law-like. The pattern that is quantitatively observable at some point changes radically and fundamentally. We call that a qualitative change. You could say a new synthesis, and hence things then take on a different quality, a different law, a different pattern of movement.
Yeah.
So I mean that's it. And so therefore we are talking about modern physics, modern biology, modern social analysis. You know what I'm saying? That is the difference. You say, well, he was a German. Well, so was Beethoven. And I don't think Duke Ellington had a problem with Beethoven. And if Duke Ellington didn't have a problem with Beethoven, why should I have a problem with Hegel? You know what I'm saying?
We drink from the fountain of knowledge. We drink from the fountain of knowledge from
That's right, wherever it is. See, that's the way I like to roll. So don't compartmentalize me, you know, in such a way that I can't do nothing but what you authorize that I can do. Under the name of we only deal with women, or I only deal with blacks, and I got a dashiki on.
Right.
I don't wear dashikis. I do wear, you know, I do wear. But I do wear dashiki.
Once he wore his dashiki.
Well, I wear mine, I got mine. She criticized me for wearing mine. I said, but you wear yours, you got yours, I got mine. But no, I'm just saying. But I don't wear it to, you know, in no fake sense of, you know, like I'm saying, I'm supposed to be so African.
Right.
See, that's a fraud. See, you can have a dashiki on, but underneath you think like Kant. You neo-Kantian with a dashiki. So what does this dashiki mean? It don't mean much of anything. But I'm saying, in other words, let us get to the substance of matters. Don't divert me with identity politics. Let's keep it 100. Let's get to essences. Now, of course, in American pragmatism, to talk about essence is to be, oh, you're an essentialist. You know, you trying to get to create, how do they make that argument now? Excuse me, I forget. It's such a fake argument. To say, if you say there is an essence of things, like at the China conference, we said that Maoism was an attempt to get at the Chinese essence of the revolutionary process. Remember we did that? So there's certain cultural thinkers, neo-pragmatist thinkers, I like to call them, who say that any reference to an essence is to make you an essentialist and hence a reductionist, and to want to think about things in a static way. You get many neo-pragmatists, and you get that in Cornell West. It's so, I wish Cornel West would come to the free school. He needs a free school bad. I mean, for real. And I love the man, love him to death, but he needs a free school because and it was a form of academic terrorism, where if you spoke about the essence of something, and I want to, if you don't mind, I want to say something about what we mean by essence. Everybody don't mean the main thing. That means that you were reductionist. In other words, you were saying that, quote, a man is a man and a woman is a woman. And how do you know the difference? Well, there is an essence of manhood, an essence of womanhood. But that's not what we're doing. There is essence, but it is discovered in the laws of development of a phenomenon. Now, to say that is not to answer every question of what is and yada, yada, yada. It is just to say that from a logical philosophical standpoint, essence does not mean for us a static essence. Essence for us means an emergent, developing phenomenon. In other words, if essence means to capture a phenomenon, to know something, and we would say to know something is to know its essence. But for us, the essence of something is in its development. That is why, this is why the things that we were going through about quantum mechanics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is why studying quantum mechanics in the philosophical way that we're trying to do it is a way to understand exactly what we're talking about in essence in this regard, in the way we're talking about it. Because, see, this is, oh God, I just get so tied up in the way I talk. I don't mean, I don't want to be, to make things not understandable. This is the mistake that Niels Bohr's made. And this is why Niels Bohr, the 1925 Copenhagen conference, the mistake that he made was to argue that there is no essence outside of my experience of a thing that's phenomenal form. If I can't experience it, it doesn't exist. When I experience it, it comes into existence. Okay? There is no independent essence. We can call it being. Sometimes the two are kind of the same. But Niels Bohr said these quantum phenomena don't exist until the experiment. You see what I'm saying? Einstein was never satisfied with that. Einstein died too early, too young, you might say, in 1955, which then allowed the can to be kicked down the street further and further, and it's still unresolved. But this thing of terrorizing people, that if you use the word essence, you're an essentialist, you're reductionist, that you want to define things in a way that's politically suitable, philosophically suitable to you. That's what they were saying. And therefore, it pushes people back to pragmatism and what in the 18th century was called empiricism. That since you can't know the essence of anything, you only deal with it as it appears. and you know, it's, and in a lot of ways, you know, when y'all's unhappiness with education and say, well, we could never resolve anything. You never, the professor, well, it could be, and then it don't have to be. And I don't know either. What am I paying you for? But it is this attempt to avoid the question of being in essence at the heart of it. You know, for instance, I see it in Cornell. I saw, and I'm still trying to get through these 8 lectures that he did on Du Bois's philosophy of history. And Nuri, I know that you are very if you can do it, I would, no, seriously, man, I can't get, it just disturbs me. But maybe you can, please. I mean, I beseech you, I call upon, I beg you to do it, and then you tell me. But what he is doing, see, Du Bois, he can't be honest, and I won't say honest. He cannot understand Du Bois's philosophy of history or philosophy, period, because he's starting from an opposite place. It's something like Einstein and Niels Bohr. You know what I'm saying? They're 2 irreconcilable positions. Although I always say Niels Bohr was right about it's a partial truth there. We have to experience it to know it. But again, what Niels Bohr could not grasp is that we know it not just through our experience, but through the assumptions that we bring to the experience. There is already a mediation. You see what I'm saying? Niels Bohr was not philosophically, was not even as advanced as Kant. We could talk more about that. So, I don't know that Cornell has read Hegel. He may have read about Hegel's Science of Logic. I don't know that he has read Kant. It was not required reading for at least 2 generations of people studying philosophy. And certainly after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rewriting of the great Soviet encyclopedia to be bullshit, you know, at least we still have the original, and I'm trying to get a used version of it at a cheap price, but it might be going up now that Putin is back. But since that, the philosophers in this country went buck wild with this return to British empiricism. See, can't you dig it? The West is back. But for the Americans, it meant Anglo-American philosophy. We're back. You know, the end of history. Let's keep it real. You know, F that continental European philosophy, Kant, Hegel. We back to Hume and neo-pragmatism. Can you dig it? And that's what it was. And few stood and said, no, man, that ain't happening. This, or as the Bible says, this too will pass, and this too has passed. Want to ask me anything? Go ahead, Doug.
I feel like today's discussion was significant because it made me question what even is logic to begin with. And you're talking about pragmatism without foundations, and in many ways you're also saying there's a certain way of being that is dominant in America that has no moral foundation. And I think it made me realize that there is morality within logic, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that was always an assumption in many of our discussions because we've read King and Du Bois, and morality morality and humanity is at the core of what they're doing, I guess. But it just made me explicitly articulate to myself that morality is part of logic, and I guess, or I think that's what we're saying, and I hope there's some more of that in whatever Hegel we continue to read. And I think also what was significant was I think me realizing that there is greater ramifications of how philosophy is done in the politics of today, and I think what you're bringing up about Hume and even, I guess, British empiricism
Right.
is linked to even things like critical theory or critical race theory, where
There's no question
you
about
have
that.
your personal experience of like a microaggression in an institution, and then your response is to just call it out and cancel the whole thing. Whereas I guess a Hegelian way of doing things or thinking about things is to see it, as you're saying, in their essence of becoming and being in motion and growing. And in some ways it also feels like the project of building a democracy, of always seeing it in development towards the truth, I guess. But I don't know, that was just my synthesis of everything that we have been talking about in the past couple of weeks. And even though I guess we didn't actually read Hegel today, I am really excited to continue to read Hegel and work through these questions of what even is logic or reason, and how philosophy continues to affect how we do politics. So.
Wow, you always drop these bombs at the end. Go ahead, Eddie.
Seeing a lot of this like discussion online, sorry about standing, I can't bear to sit very long, but seeing the discussions online about like the trans swimmers and like, oh, what is a woman, like it seems like there's a real lack of a real hunger for this kind of philosophy of like in asking the question, what is a woman, like how do I know what I know, like how do I
Yeah. This is another part of
what makes a woman and what makes a man, and I'm very curious to kind of know what, I guess a more conservative person might think philosophically, because I don't think people care that much about women's sports or anything like that, but this is really like a battle of like, how do we know what we know? How do we like ascertain the truth? What do we make of this subjective experience? And without any of these philosophical underpinnings, I think people are just taking it the moral argument of, we should just love and accept everybody, which is like not a bad argument, but like that still doesn't deal with like what is the truth. And I'm very grateful that we might get a little closer here. Oh, I think we're gonna get a lot closer.
Well, listening to you and Doe at the end, it makes me feel I should have kept my mouth shut a little more doing it, because these are such, first of all, when that senator asked the Supreme Court nomination, what is a woman, nominee, what is a woman? And the Supreme Court, first of all, to ask a question in that way was disingenuous and in bad faith, because it was one of those gotcha moments. But the answer was not a adequate answer. This whole idea that I'm not a biologist. I felt that it was her trying to say I'm not going to be drugged into a gotcha moment, maybe. Or it could have represented a kind of intellectual superficialness. Because the question was an opportunity to demonstrate some intellectual breadth, including law, biology, society, culture. But, one of the things I'm going to say in the interview when I do it is that she is like most of them on the Supreme Court, intellectually empty and barren. But the question that you put, how do we know what we know? One thing is, what we know is never absolutely known. You know, and so to know is a historical process. It's a collective process. Frankly, it's an all-humanity process. No civilization, not like these bums are going all around the world pointing their fingers at representatives of large nations and ancient civilizations like they're nothing. I take that I take that personally, by the way, because it is one of the highest expressions of white supremacy. You know, but you know, this is why this moment of transformation and transition is so important, because I see as part of the outcome of this, as civilizations, especially of Asia, unite against Western predation, meaning being predatory and aggressive, their civilizations will unite, and it can be an explosion, a renaissance of knowing. No one civilization has all the answers. Science is not the end-all, be-all of knowing. It represented a great revolution and leap forward, but it's not the be-all and end-all. That's what Derek is talking about. Science used against humanity ceases the mission or the enterprise of science and turns it into its opposite. So, how do we know what we know? You can test whether the person asking the question is genuine or not, because sometimes the person asking the question already knows that we cannot know what we know. So it's a disingenuous or bad faith question. Which is cynicism. And you get a lot of that going on. You know, you claim that you're seeking for the truth. Well, how do you know what you say you know? So it's like a gotcha thing, you know? And most people don't know how to answer that question. So the person answering it already assumes that the person they're asking it to does not have a way of answering that question. So the person asking it is a cynic, you know, and there's nothing worse than that when you're in a discussion. The other thing is that there is a skeptic, you know, who will say that we cannot know what we say we know. We can say we know it, but we really don't know that we know anything. That's the skepticism position. Both positions can lead to nihilism and pessimism. You know, which again is why people like you all and like me are so angry a lot of the time. You know, having encountered the kind of people we encounter. But there is a way to begin to answer that question. And that is what I think the answer I gave is. That one, the answer to the question is not to be found in, quote, absolute knowledge. Right? All knowledge is relative and expands through time. Unless, and here is the great historical, social question, unless that normal process of humanity is interrupted by war and oppression. You know what I'm saying? That is why, again, I want to say, to trump, no pun intended, to trump this war administration is to open the door for a new humanity, civilizational flowering. See, the Chinese are right. Xi Jinping and them are right. Why do all political issues have to be zero-sum outcomes? In other words, either you with the United States or you with Russia. Can't I just be with peace and the truth? But see, once you get that bifurcation, that polarity thing, then the normal processes of mutual human development is aborted, is undermined. You dig what I'm saying? Because, see this thing of how do we know what we know is the truth or whatever? That ain't just no one civilizational thing. That's multiple civilization. That's all humanity. You know what I'm saying? You can't be for war and be for the discovery of truth. War and oppression and this that these people are carrying out goes against discovering the truth. So, answer. The third option, which is not an absolute answer, because there is no absolute truth, because nothing exists in absolute staticness. Everything exists in motion, including the observers, the people seeking to know. So we come close, although never completely knowing anything absolutely. Then the question is, then what is truth? It's not absolute. It's not a metaphysical truth. It's not truth for all time. Truth is the human experience with the world that is not us, that is more than us. It is our ability to come close to knowing all of that complexity, which is way more than us. You know, just like they talk about billions of solar systems, billions of galaxies. Well, let's just call it what it is, infinity.
Yeah.
Our knowledge is never infinite. Our knowledge is finite because we are finite. But there's nothing wrong with that. It's what Martin Luther King called the third dimension of a complete life. It's a humbling dimension. It's not the self. It's not even humanity, which we can all empathize with. It is the dimension of the cosmic, of the infinite. And what does it mean to be finite in a world, a universe that is infinite? It means that you just got to be humble and realize that we are constantly working on improving our knowledge and who we are. This is why it is so grotesque. I say again, grotesque. The way these people are going around the world and pointing their fingers, because what you're saying to people that see that, oh, that's the way you treat the Chinese. That's the way you talk to them. Raise your voice. See, if he wasn't on television and the ambassador, he could have jumped up and bitch slapped her.
Oh my God.
And knocked that wig off her head. Excuse my harsh language. You understand what I'm saying? Smacked her upside her head. Who you talking to? I mean, just in the day-to-day life, you can't talk to people on the street that way. You ride scepter, you get in somebody's face, you don't know who you're talking to, they jump up and knock you out. But she was given permission by the ruling class to talk to that man. I mean, he'll tell you, wasn't it unbelievable, Jerry?
Yeah.
And she, could you, Mr. Ambassador, wasn't even no Mr. Ambassador no more. She started out with that then she just got raw. Why can't you condemn it? She got real, ghetto, as they say, with him. And he didn't because he's from a different civilization. People don't act like that everywhere in the world. There's a certain politeness. And that he's a diplomat. He's trained in politeness, in diplomatic etiquette. And she got real raw. But, you see, that's the morality of an immoral culture. That's their morality. And see, what we have to guard against, that it never becomes ours. That third dimension, the humbleness of a finite being in an infinite cosmos. That does something to you when you think like that. You know what I'm saying? You can't be a cultural feminist, where it's me, and my pronouns, and say my name, and put some respect on me, and all that old shit. See, that's why, by the way, I just bring this in. Sun Ra. Space is the place. The infinite. He was talking allegorically, you know what I'm saying? But I shut my mouth. Go ahead. Go ahead, Emil.
Quick response.
Oh, go ahead. Go.
You should have got the Supreme Court nomination. You could have given. They could have asked.
Say that one more time.
You should have got the Supreme Court nomination. So you could have asked that question. What is a woman? You could have hit him with this. That's all I'm saying.
Well, but see, all I'm saying, see these people. That's why I know the Supreme Court is just a show thing. It's a kangaroo court, as they call it, because the people on it are intellectually empty. But go ahead, Emil, and then Derek.
Yes, this process you're describing, it makes me think of how the sense I get is that the goal here is to separate humanity from its core principles, from human beings, from what they've cultivated collectively over generations and generations and generations. Because like you said, it's true, we can only see from our own perceptions. And there's two ways you can take that, right? One way you can take that is you can say, well, I see just as much as what you can see, so my truth is righteously the greatest truth. Another way you could take that is, like you said, humbly. You could say, well, we both don't know everything, so let's work together and see what collectively we can come to some kind of conclusion on, and work from there and continue that process. And that arrogance, like you said, is demonstrated in that interviewer, but also, I mean, just thinking about it, I didn't really see much of this this confirmation hearing, is that what it's called?
Yes.
But I did hear one part where she was discussing how she's so proud to be the first, African American woman on the Supreme Court. So clearly she knows how to use that term in a way that's advantageous to her. But the second it becomes, oh, well, now you got to make a decision. What do you mean by it when you say you're the first? Oh, well, I'm not going to take that stand because that's not politically advantageous to me. So I'm going to separate myself from, what it means to be a human being. Human beings, we struggle. That's
why we are here. We think of these questions of morality and of truth and of peace, and we work together ultimately. That's what we do, really, as much as we divide and fight one another. So,
Well, Serafina said we have to get ready
We
to
gotta
go.
get out.
Because she has to go to her third job.
I just want to read out some comments from Jamila. Jamila says, "Thank you, Jeremiah."
Who is that?
Jamila Wilson.
Oh, Jamila. Oh,
She says, "Thank you, Jeremiah, for referencing Du Bois's writings and the impact of silence on the soul of our collective humanity."
Yeah, that was good.
Du Bois becomes more and more relevant every moment that we exist. And the Saturday Free School is the saving grace. And then she also says, John Stuart Mill's The Marketplace of Ideas. Where does that sit within Hegelian thought? My understanding of the marketplace of ideas is we all have half-truths, and the marketplace allows us to bring them all together to construct the whole truth.
I agree with her about the market. That is the best. John Stuart Mill is the best of liberalism. I think after him, it's pretty much been going downhill all the time.
I just wanted to say one thing about King's letter that he's speaking about Paul, but you might not want to be. We familiar with people, but sometimes we so unfamiliar with the philosophical religious principles inside the Bible or Holy Book, and so that kind of talk of bringing Paul into this dimensional thing is not just the three-dimensional. The fourth dimension is the physics field, but King is speaking like I'm talking to through Paul, but Paul is talking to a whole nation, and you have to almost go into Asia Minor to understand.
Can I ask you a question? Why do you say Paul and not John?
Because it's kind of like when you growing up in Christianity, that became some of my letters.
King has a letter. King has a letter of like Paul's letter to the American Christians.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that some in your own search for your own identity.
Wait, John, what you saying with John?
Huh?
What are you saying with John? What's the difference?
No, because the book of John.
I know.
Not John of Patmos. Yeah. The book of John, where
two Johns.
Yeah, it's two Johns in the New
John 1 and
Testament.
John 2.
But the John that says, if you ask him what is God, he say God is love. Yeah. And you cannot love God if you don't love your fellow human being. Yeah. And I think that's. But anyway, I think King is. I was just thinking King is closer to John.
Yeah.
Than to Paul. I would argue. Yeah. But I could be wrong.
But he's using them, but he's speaking as a vehicle.
Oh yeah.
You can't. We just thinking that we just hear all these things we talking about with Hegel, all these things, and that can't come in. That's going to come in whether you like it or not. We in this church here. Think you just in here because you just decide you gonna walk down through here? This is a lot of inspiration, aspirations. It's feelings y'all done carried around for y'all whole childhood. You ain't just like that. So Paul is somebody inside that book that sometimes you don't really know what you're doing. But if you ain't no believer in anything, it still don't matter because it's some content that was addressed to like humanity as a human being. Everybody has some role in their life to fulfill. And not just be unhappy, not to be just angry. This is part of like the struggle is suffering because you're going to suffer some through the struggle. That's how you become a testifier to like you've been in the fire. Now you know what the fire feel like.
So you're saying Paul, in relationship to the struggle to become.
It's a philosophical foundation somewhere, but it's not so hardcore because I might not even ever mention it because I might just go to church and be like, hey man, okay. But you gotta feel that feeling that something more is pressing upon us. It's in your heart. I watched last week. I could have been crying. The tears is like a manifestation of being anointed. Now nobody else might not say that. So y'all was being anointed while we was in talking, because you said something from your heart. It struck me inside. I said, "Oh my God, you know, this is the feeling that the church is reigning to cry for your work. You're not doing something just for yourself. You're doing something for the self of all selves that are connected, no matter where you exist at, and it means something."
Can I ask you? And then you associate with anointing.
That's what it is.
I
You
agree
ask
with you.
Farrakhan knows this conversation because it's something about having this
It is
testimony.
something. It is something
You know
very
what I mean?
religious
Yes,
about
it's
this.
just a
very spiritual about
it's a
it.
very powerful, political, religious, philosophical insights to bring what we doing in the free school.
This is very.
You know,
let me just say this. When I was working in the prison, Tony,
Yeah.
I saw inmates take tears and anoint each other.
Thank you. It's in Islam. In Islam, it's two words. It's two words in Baraka. It's two words in Baraka that possess you bless. Whether one don't want to read about it, it's like having a way of a blessing, because you just can't keep going through this road here without, you know, something that gives you the humility that I'm in this struggle for life, and I don't mind sharing my life and giving my life for something that I share life with. It's this inside this seed. He knows inside this seed, and this seed got potential to do two things. It can destroy or it can create. We're inside like that kind of temporal right now. We're in the essence of the peace being materialized into the material world, or we're in the destruction. It's already in. That's something that mountains are made out and reclaimed. So we can be reclaimed or we can be redeemed. She used that word redemption. I said, okay. Last week she used that word redemption. So this is like, it's not a theology. I'm agreeing with Tony. I could be a Hegelian. I've been around German students for a long period of time, and I'm not ignorant about having respect and having regard for our soul means something to people's souls. You don't want to say people is soulless. Yeah.
Okay,
It's folk.
we have to get ready to go. I'm sorry. I don't mean.
Yeah,
Thank you
I'm
very
good.
much, Derek.
Thank y'all.
That was a good place to end.
Yeah.
Wow. Serafina has to get ready for her third job, so we have to get out of here.
Actually,